Chapter 16 of The Roman Hat Mystery by Ellery Queen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16, in which the Queens go to the theater. Ellery and his father regarded each other across the length of the little office. Veli had resumed his seat with a puzzled frown. He sat quietly for a time in the growing silence, seemed suddenly to make a decision, and asking permission, left the room. The inspector grinned as he fumbled with the lid of his snuff-box. "Did you get a scare too, Ellery?" Ellery, however, was serious. "That woman gives me a case of Woodhouse Willies," he said, shuddering. "Scare is much too mild a word." "I couldn't for the moment grasp the significance of her attitude," said Inspector Queen. "To think that she knew while we have been fumbling around. It scattered my wits." "I should say the interview was highly successful," commented Ellery, "principally because I've been gathering a few interesting facts from this ponderous tome on chirography. But Mrs. Angela Russo does not measure up to my conception of perfect womanhood." "If you ask me," chuckled the inspector, "our beauteous friend has a crush on you. Consider the opportunities, my son." Ellery made a grimace of profound distaste. "Well," Queen reached for one of the telephones on the desk, "do you think we ought to give Benjamin Morgan another chance, Ellery?" "Hanged if he deserves it," grumbled Ellery. "But I suppose it's the routine thing to do." "You forget the papers, son, the papers," retorted the inspector, a twinkle in his eye. He spoke to the police operator in pleasant accents, and a few moments later the buzzer sounded. "Good afternoon, Mr. Morgan," Queen said cheerfully. "And how are you today?" "Inspector Queen?" asked Morgan after a slight hesitation. "Good afternoon to you, sir. How is the case progressing?" "That's a fair question, Mr. Morgan," laughed the inspector. "One, however, which I daren't answer for fear of being accused of incompetency. Mr. Morgan, are you free this evening by any chance?" Pause. "Why, not free exactly." The lawyer's voice was barely audible. "I am due at home, of course, for dinner, and I believe my wife has arranged a little bridge. Why, Inspector?" "I was thinking of asking you to dine with my son and me this evening," said the inspector regretfully. "Could you possibly get away for the dinner hour?" A longer pause. "If it's absolutely necessary, Inspector." "I wouldn't put it that way exactly, Mr. Morgan, but I would appreciate your accepting the invitation." "Oh." Morgan's voice came more resolutely now. "In that case, I'm at your command, Inspector. Where shall I meet you?" That's fine, said Queen. "How about Carlos at 6?" "Very well, Inspector," returned the lawyer quietly, and hung up the receiver. "I can't help feeling sorry for the poor chap," murmured the old man. Ellery grunted. He was not feeling inclined to sympathize. The taste of Mrs. Angela Russo was still strong in his mouth, and it was not a pleasant taste at all. Promptly at 6 o'clock, Inspector Queen and Ellery joined Benjamin Morgan in the convivial atmosphere of Carlos' restaurant foyer. He was sitting dejectedly in a red leather chair, staring at the backs of his hands. His lips drooped sadly, his knees were widely separated in an instinctive attitude of depression. He made a laudable attempt to smile as the two queens approached. He rose with a firmness that indicated to his keen hosts a mind determined upon a fixed course of action. The inspector was at his bubbling best, partly because he felt a genuine liking for the corpulent attorney, and partly because it was his business. Ellery, as usual, was non-committal. The three men shook hands like old friends. "Glad to see you're on time, Morgan," said the inspector, as a stiff head-waiter conducted them to a corner table. "I really must apologize for taking you away from your dinner at home. There was a time once—" He sighed, and they sat down. "No apology necessary," said Morgan with a wan smile. I suppose you know that every married man relishes a bachelor dinner at times. Just what is it, Inspector, you wanted to talk to me about?" The old man raised a warning finger. "No business now, Morgan," he said. "I have an idea Lewis has something up his sleeve in the way of solid refreshment. Right, Lewis?" The dinner was a culinary delight. The inspector, who was quite indifferent to the nuances of the art, had left the details of the menu to his son. Ellery was fantastically interested in the delicate subject of foods and their preparation. Consequently, the three men dined well. Morgan was at first inclined to taste his food abstractedly, but he became more and more alive to the delightful concoctions placed before him, until finally he forgot his troubles altogether and chatted and laughed with his hosts. With café au lait and excellent cigars, which Ellery smoked cautiously, the inspector diffidently, and Morgan with enjoyment, Queen came to the point. "Morgan, I'm not going to beat around the bush. I have an idea you know why I asked you here tonight. I'm going to be perfectly honest. I want the true explanation for your silence regarding the events of Sunday night, September the 23rd, 4 nights ago." Morgan had become grave immediately the inspector began to speak. He put the cigar on the ashtray and regarded the old man with an expression of ineffable weariness. "It was bound to come," he said. "I might have known that you would find out sooner or later. I suppose Mrs. Russo told you out of spite." "She did," confessed Queen frankly. "As a gentleman, I refuse to listen to tales. As a policeman, it is my duty. Why have you kept this from me, Morgan?" Morgan traced a meaningless figure on the cloth with a spoon. Because a man is always a fool until he is made to realize the extent of his folly," he said quietly, looking up. "I hoped and prayed, it is a human failing, I suppose, that the incident would remain a secret between a dead man and myself. And to find that prostitute was hiding in the bedroom, listening to every word I said, it rather took the wind out of my sails." He gulped down a glass of water, rushing ahead. "The God's honest truth, Inspector, is that I thought I was being drawn into a trap, and I couldn't bring myself to furnish contributory evidence. There I found myself in the theater, not so far away from my worst enemy, found murdered. I could not explain my presence except by an apparently silly and unsubstantiated story, and I remembered in a bitter flash that I had actually quarreled with the dead man the night before. It was a tight position, Inspector. Take my word for it." Inspector Queen said nothing. Ellery was leaning far back in his chair, watching Morgan with gloomy eyes. Morgan swallowed hard and went on. "That's why I didn't say anything. Can you blame a man for keeping quiet when his legal training warns him so decisively of the net of circumstantial evidence he is helping to manufacture?" Queen was silent for a moment. Then, "We'll let that pass for the moment, Morgan. Why did you go to see Field Sunday night?" "For a very good reason," answered the lawyer bitterly. "On Thursday a week ago, Field called me up at my office and told me that he was making a last business venture that entailed his procuring $50,000 at once." $50,000. Morgan laughed dryly. "After he had milked me until I was as flabby financially as an old cow. And this business venture, can you imagine what it was? If you knew Field as well as I did, you would find the answer on the racetracks and the stock market. Perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps he was hard-pressed for money and was cleaning up his old accounts. At any rate, he wanted the $50,000 on a brand-new proposition, that he would actually return the original documents to me for that sum. It was the first time he had even suggested such a thing. Every time before, he had insolently asked blackmail for silence. This time it was a buy-and-sell proposition." "That's an interesting point, Mr. Morgan," put in Ellery with a flicker of his eyes. "Did anything in his conversation definitely lead you to suspect that he was cleaning up old accounts, as you phrase it?" Yes, that is why I said what I did. He gave me the impression that he was hard up, meant to take a little vacation. Vacation to him would be a 3-year jaunt on the continent, no less, and was soliciting all his friends. I never knew he was in the blackmailing business on a large scale, but this time— Ellery and the inspector exchanged glances. Morgan forged ahead. I told him the truth, that I was in a bad way financially, chiefly through him, and that it would be absolutely impossible for me to raise the preposterous amount he demanded. He merely laughed, insisted on getting the money. I was most anxious to get the papers back, of course. Had you verified from your cancelled vouchers the fact that some were missing? Asked the inspector. It wasn't necessary, Inspector, grated Morgan. He actually exhibited the vouchers and letters for my benefit in the Webster Club 2 years ago, when we had the quarrel. Oh, there was no question about it. He was top man. Go on. He hung up on me with a thinly veiled threat last Thursday. I had tried desperately during the conversation to make him believe that I would in some way meet his demands, because I knew that he would have no scruples at all about publishing the papers once he realized he had sucked me dry. "Did you ask him if you could see the documents?" asked Ellery. "I believe I did, but he laughed at me and said I would see the color of my checks and letters when he saw the color of my money. He was nobody's fool, that crook. He was taking no chances on my doing him in while he brought out the damning evidence. You see how frank I am? I will even admit that at times the thought of violence entered my mind. What man could keep from thinking such thoughts under such circumstances? But I never entertain homicidal fancies seriously, gentlemen, for a very good reason." He paused. "It wouldn't have done you any good," said Ellery softly. "You didn't know where the documents were." "Exactly," returned Morgan with a tremulous smile. "I didn't know. And with those papers liable to come to light at any time, to fall into anybody's hands, what good would Field's death have done me? I would probably have exchanged a bad taskmaster for a worse. On Sunday night, after trying for 3 terrible days to get together the money he asked for, with no result, I decided to come to a final settlement with him. I went to his apartment and found him in a dressing gown, much surprised and not at all apprehensive at seeing me. The living room was upset. I did not know at the time that Mrs. Russo was hiding in the next room." He relit the cigar with shaking fingers. "We quarreled, or rather I quarreled and he sneered. He would listen to no argument, to no plea. He wanted the 50,000, or he would send the story around and the proofs. It sort of got on my nerves after a while. I left before I lost control of myself utterly. And that's all, Inspector, on my word of honor as a gentleman and as an unfortunate victim of circumstances." He turned his head away. Inspector Queen coughed and threw his cigar into the ashtray. He fumbled in his pocket for the brown snuff-box, took a pinch, inhaled deeply, and leaned back in his chair. Ellery suddenly poured a glass of water for Mr. Morgan, who took it and drained it. "Thank you, Morgan," said Queen. "And since you have been so frank in your story, please be honest and tell me whether you threatened Field's life Sunday night during your quarrel. It is only fair to let you know that Mrs. Russo flatly accused you of Field's murder because of something you said in the heat of the moment." Morgan grew pale. His brows twitched, and his eyes, glazed and worried, stared pitifully at the inspector. "She was lying!" he cried hoarsely. Several diners nearby looked around curiously, and Inspector Queen tapped Morgan's arm. He bit his lip and lowered his voice. "I did nothing of the sort, Inspector. I was honest with you a moment ago when I said that I had thought savagely from time to time of killing Field. It was a crippled, silly, pointless thought. I wouldn't have the courage to kill a man. Even at the Webster Club, when I lost my temper completely and shouted that threat, I didn't mean it. Certainly Sunday night. Please believe me rather than that unscrupulous, money-grubbing harlot, Inspector. You must." "I merely want you to explain what you said. Because," said the inspector quietly, "strange as it may seem, I do believe that you made the statement she attributes to you." "What statement?" Morgan was in a sweat of fear. His eyes started from his head. "Publish those papers, and if it means ruin to me, I'll see to it that it's the last time you'll ever blackmail anybody," repeated the inspector. "Did you say that, Mr. Morgan?" The lawyer stared incredulously at the Queens, then threw back his head and laughed. "Good heavens!" he gasped at last. "Is that the threat I made? Why, Inspector, what I meant was that if he published those documents, in the event that I couldn't meet his blackguard demands, that I would make a clean breast of it to the police and drag him down with me. That's what I meant. And she thought I was threatening his life." He wiped his eyes hysterically. Ellery smiled, his fingers summoning the waiter. He paid the check and lit a cigarette, looking sidewise at his father, who was regarding Morgan with a mixture of abstraction and sympathy. "Very well, Morgan." The inspector rose, pushed back his chair. "That's all we wanted to know." He stood aside courteously to allow the dazed, still trembling lawyer to precede them toward the cloakroom. The sidewalk fronting the Roman Theater was jammed when the two Queens strolled up 47th Street from Broadway. The crowd was so huge that police lines had been established. Traffic was at a complete standstill along the entire length of the narrow thoroughfare. The electric lights of the marquee blared forth the title "Gunplay" in vigorous dashes of light, and in smaller lights the legend, "Starring James Peele and Eve Ellis, supported by an all-star cast." Women and men wielded frenzied elbows to push through the milling mob. Policemen shouted hoarsely, demanding tickets for the evening's performance before they would allow anyone to pass through the lines. The inspector showed his badge, and he and Ellery were hurled with the jostling crowd into the small lobby of the theater. Beside the box office, his Latin face wreathed in smiles, stood Manager Panzer, courteous, firm, and authoritative, helping to speed the long line of cash customers from the box office window to the ticket taker. The venerable doorman, perspiring mightily, was standing to one side, a bewildered expression on his face. The cashiers worked madly. Harry Nielsen was huddled in a corner of the lobby, talking earnestly to three young men who were obviously reporters. Panzer caught sight of the two Queens and hurried forward to greet them. At an imperious gesture from the inspector, he hesitated, then, with an understanding nod, turned back to the cashier's window. Ellery stood meekly in line and procured 2 reserved tickets from the box office. They entered the orchestra in the midst of a pushing throng. A startled Madge O'Connell fell back as Ellery presented 2 tickets plainly marked LL32 left and LL30 left. The inspector smiled as she fumbled with the pasteboards and threw him a half-fearful glance. She led them across the thick carpet to the extreme left aisle, silently indicated the last 2 seats of the last row, and fled. The 2 men sat down, placed their hats in the wire holders below the seats, and leaned back comfortably, for all the world like 2 pleasure-seekers contemplating an evening's gory entertainment. The auditorium was packed. Droves of people being ushered down the aisles were rapidly consuming the empty seats. Heads twisted expectantly in the direction of the Queens, who became unwittingly the center of a most unwelcome scrutiny. "Heck," grumbled the old man. "We should have come in after the curtain went up." "You're much too sensitive to public acclaim, mon père," laughed Ellery. "I don't mind the limelight." He consulted his wristwatch, and their glances met significantly. It was exactly 8:25. They wriggled in their seats and settled down. The lights were blotted out one by one. The chatter of the audience died in a responsive sympathy. In total darkness, the curtain rose on a weirdly dim stage. A shot exploded the silence. A man's gurgling shout raised gasps in the theater. Gunplay was off in its widely publicized and theatrical manner. Despite the preoccupation of his father, Ellery, relaxed in the chair which 3 nights before had held the dead body of Monty Field, was able to sit still and enjoy the exceedingly mellow melodrama. The fine, rich voice of James Peele, ushered onto the stage by a series of climactic incidents, rang out and thrilled him with its commanding art. Eve Ellis's utter absorption in her role was apparent. At the moment, she was conversing in low, throbbing tones with Stephen Barry, whose handsome face and pleasant voice were evoking admiring comment from a young girl seated directly to the inspector's right. Hilda Orange was huddled in a corner, dressed flamboyantly as befitted her stage character. The old character man pottered aimlessly about the stage. Ellery leaned toward his father. "It's a well-cast production," he whispered. "Watch that orange woman." The play stuttered and crackled on. With a crashing symphony of words and noise, the first act came to an end. The inspector consulted his watch as the light snapped on. It was 9:05. He rose, and Ellery followed him lazily. Madge O'Connell, pretending not to notice them, pushed open the heavy iron doors across the aisle, and the audience began to file out into the dimly lit alleyway. The 2 queens sauntered out among the others. A uniformed boy standing behind a neat stand covered with paper cups was crying his wares in a subdued, refined voice. It was Jess Lynch, the boy who had testified in the matter of Monty Field's request for ginger ale. Ellery strolled behind the iron door. There was a cramped space between the door and the brick wall. He noticed that the wall of the building flanking the other side of the alley was easily 6 stories high and unbroken. The inspector bought an orange drink from the boy. Jess Lynch recognized him with a start, and Inspector Queen greeted the boy pleasantly. People were standing in small groups, their attitudes betokening a strange interest in their surroundings. The inspector heard a woman remark in a fearful, fascinated voice, "They say he was standing right out here Monday night, buying an orange drink." The warning bell soon clanged inside the theater, and those who had come outside for a breath of air hurried back into the orchestra. Before he sat down, the inspector glanced over across the rear of the auditorium to the foot of the staircase leading to the balcony. A stalwart, uniformed young man stood alertly on the first step. The second act exploded into being. The audience swayed and gasped in the approved fashion, while the dramatic fireworks were shot off on the stage. The queen seemed suddenly to have become absorbed in the action. Father and son leaned forward, bodies taut, eyes intent. Ellery consulted his watch at 9:30, and the 2 queens settled back again while the play rumbled on. At 9:50 exactly they rose, took their hats and coats, and slipped out of the LL row into the clear space behind the orchestra. A number of people were standing, at which the inspector smiled and blessed the power of the press beneath his breath. The white-faced usherette, Madge O'Connell, was leaning stiffly against a pillar, staring unseeingly ahead. The queens, espying Manager Panzer in the doorway of his office, beaming delightedly at the crowded auditorium, made their way towards him. The inspector motioned him inside and rapidly stepped into the little anteroom, Ellery close behind. The smile faded from Panzer's face. "I hope you've had a profitable evening?" he asked nervously. "Profitable evening? Well, it depends upon what you mean by the word." The old man gestured briefly and led the way through the second door into Panzer's private office. "Look here, Panzer," he said, pacing up and down in some excitement. "Have you a plan of the orchestra handy which shows each seat numbered and all the exits?" Panzer stared. "I think so. Just a moment." He fumbled in a filing cabinet, rummaged among some folders, and finally brought out a large map of the theater, separated into 2 sections, one for the orchestra and the other for the balcony. The inspector brushed the second away impatiently as he and Ellery bent over the orchestra plan. They studied it for a moment. Queen looked up at Panzer, who was shifting from one foot to another on the rug, evidently at a loss to know what would be required of him next. "May I have this map, Panzer?" asked the inspector shortly. "I'll return it unharmed in a few days." "Certainly, certainly," said Panzer. "Is there anything else I can do for you now, Inspector?" "I want to thank you for your consideration in the matter of publicity, sir. Gordon Davis is extremely pleased at the house tonight. He asked me to relay his thanks." "Not at all, not at all," grumbled the inspector, folding the map and putting it in his breast pocket. "It was coming to you. What's right is right. And now, Ellery, if you'll come along. Good night, Panzer. Not a word about this, remember?" The two queens slipped out of Panzer's office while he was babbling his reassurances of silence. They crossed the rear of the orchestra once more in the direction of the extreme left aisle. The inspector beckoned curtly to Madge O'Connell. "Yes," she breathed, her face chalky. "Just open the doors wide enough to let us through, O'Connell, and forget all about it afterward. Understand?" said the inspector grimly. She mumbled under her breath as she pushed open one of the big iron doors opposite the LL row. With a last warning shake of the head, the inspector slipped through, Ellery following, and the door came softly back into place again. At 11 o'clock, as the wide exits were disgorging their first flocks of theater-goers after the final curtain, Richard and Ellery Queen re-entered the Roman Theater through the main door. End of Chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Roman Hat Mystery by Ellery Queen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17, in which more hats grow. "Sit down, Tim. Have a cup of coffee?" Tim Cronin, a keen-eyed man of medium height thatched plentifully with fire-red hair, seated himself in one of the Queen's comfortable chairs, and accepted the inspector's invitation in some embarrassment. It was Friday morning, and the inspector and Ellery, garbed romantically in colorful dressing gowns, were in high spirits. They had retired the night before at an uncommonly early hour for them. They had slept the sleep of the just. Now Juna had a pot of steaming coffee, of a variety which he blended himself, ready on the table, and indubitably all seemed right with the world. Cronin had stalked into the cheery Queen quarters at an ungodly hour, disheveled, morose, and unashamedly cursing. Not even the mild protests of the inspector were able to stem the tide of profanity which streamed from his lips, and as for Ellery, he listened to the lawyer's language with an air of grave enjoyment, as an amateur hearkens to a professional. Then Cronin awoke to his environment and blushed and was invited to sit down, and stared at the unbending back of Juna as that nimble man of affairs busied himself with the light appurtenances of the morning meal. "I don't suppose you're in a mood to apologize for your shocking language, Tim Cronin, my lad," chided the inspector, folding his hands Buddha-like over his stomach. "Do I have to inquire the reason for the bad temper?" "Not much you don't," growled Cronin, shifting his feet savagely on the rug. "You ought to be able to guess. I'm up against a blank wall in the matter of Field's papers. Blast his black soul." "It's blasted, Tim, it's blasted, never fear," said Queen sorrowfully. "Poor Field is probably roasting his toes over a sizzling little coal fire in hell just now, and chortling to himself over your profanity. Exactly what is the situation? How do things stand?" Cronin grasped the cup Juna had set before him and drained its scalding contents in a gulp. "Stand?" he cried, banging down the cup. "They don't stand. They're nil, nit, not. By Christopher, if I don't get my hands on some documentary evidence soon, I'll go batty. Why, Inspector, Stoats and I ransacked that swell office of Field's until I don't think there's a rat in the walls who dare shows his head outside a 10-foot hole, and there's nothing. Man, it's inconceivable. I'd stake my reputation that somewhere, the Lord alone knows where, Field's papers are hidden, just begging somebody to come along and carry them away." "You seem possessed of a phobia on the subject of hidden papers, Cronin," remarked Ellery mildly. "One would think we are living in the days of Charles I. There's no such thing as hidden papers. You merely have to know where to look." Cronin grinned impertinently. "That's very good of you, Mr. Queen. Suppose you suggest the place Mr. Monty Field selected to hide his papers." Ellery lit a cigarette. "All right. I accept the challenge to combat. You say, and I don't doubt your word in the least, that the documents you suppose to be in existence are not in Field's office. By the way, what makes you so sure that Field kept papers which would incriminate him in this vast clique of gangsters you told us about?" "He must have," retorted Cronin. "Queer logic, but it works. My information absolutely establishes the fact that Field had correspondence and written plans connecting him with men higher up in gangdom whom we're constantly trying to get and whom we haven't been able to touch so far. You'll have to take my word for it. It's too complicated a story to go into here. But you mark my words, Mr. Queen, Field had papers that he couldn't afford to destroy. Those are the papers I'm looking for." "Granted," said Ellery in a rhetorical tone. "I merely wish to make certain of the facts. Let me repeat, then. These papers are not in his office. We must therefore look for them farther afield. For example, they might be secreted in a safety deposit vault." "But, objected the inspector, who had listened to the interplay between Cronin and Ellery in amusement, "didn't I tell you this morning that Thomas had run that lead to earth? Field did not have a box in a safety deposit vault. That is established. He had no general delivery or private post office box either, under his real name or any other name. Thomas has also investigated Field's club affiliations and discovered that the lawyer had no residence, permanent or temporary, besides the flat on 75th Street. Furthermore, in all Thomas's scouting around, he found not the slightest indication of a possible hiding place. He thought that Field might have left the papers in a parcel or bag in the keeping of a shopkeeper or something of the sort, but there wasn't a trace. Valley's a good man in these matters, Ellery. You can bet your bottom dollar that hypothesis of yours is false." "I was making a point for Cronin's benefit," retorted Ellery. He spread his fingers on the table elaborately and winked. "You see, we must narrow the field of search to the point where we can definitely say it must be here. The office, the safety deposit vault, the post office boxes have been ruled out. Yet we know that Field could not afford to keep these documents in a place difficult of access. I cannot vouch for the papers you're seeking, Cronin, but it's different with the papers we're seeking. No, Field had them somewhere near at hand. And, to go a step further, it's reasonable to assume that he would have kept all his important secret papers in the same hiding place." Cronin scratched his head and nodded. "We shall now apply the elementary precepts, gentlemen." Ellery paused as if to emphasize his next statement. "Since we have narrowed our area of inquiry to the exclusion of all possible hiding places save one, the papers must be in that one hiding place. Nothing to that." "Now that I pause to consider," interpolated the inspector, his good humor suddenly dissipated into gloom, "perhaps we weren't as careful in that place as we might have been." "I'm as certain we're on the right track," said Ellery firmly, "as that today is Friday and there will be fish suppers in 30 million homes tonight." Cronin was looking puzzled. "I don't quite get it, Mr. Queen. What do you mean when you say there's only one possible hiding place left?" "Field's apartment, Cronin," replied Ellery imperturbably. "The papers are there." "But I was discussing the case with the DA only yesterday," objected Cronin, "and he said you'd already ransacked Field's apartment and found nothing." True enough," said Ellery. "We searched Field's apartment and found nothing. The trouble was, Cronin, that we didn't look in the right place." "Well, by ginger, if you know now, let's get a move on," cried Cronin, springing from his chair. The inspector tapped the red-haired man's knee gently and pointed to the seat. "Sit down, Tim," he advised. "Ellery is merely indulging in his favorite game of ratiocination. He doesn't know where the papers are any more than you do. He's guessing. In detective literature," he added with a sad smile, "they call it the art of deduction." "I should say," murmured Ellery, emitting a cloud of smoke, "that I'm being challenged once more. Nevertheless, although I haven't been back to Field's rooms, I intend, with Inspector Queen's kind permission, to return there and find the slippery documents." "In the matter of these papers," began the old man, when he was interrupted by the doorbell ringing. Juna admitted Sergeant Velli, who was accompanied by a small, furtive young man, so ill at ease as to be trembling. The inspector sprang to his feet and intercepted them before they could enter the living room. Cronin stared as Queen said, "This the fellow, Thomas?" And the big detective answered with grim levity, "Large as life, Inspector." "Think you could burgle an apartment without being caught, do you?" inquired the inspector genially, taking the newcomer by the arm. "You're just the man I want." The furtive young man seemed overcome by a species of terrified palsy. "Say, Inspector, you're not taking me for a ride, are you?" he stammered. The inspector smiled reassuringly and led him out into the foyer. They held a whispered and one-sided conversation, with the stranger grunting assents at every second word uttered by the old man. Cronin and Ellery in the living room caught the flash of a small sheet of paper as it passed from the inspector's hand into the clutching paw of the young man. Queen returned, stepping spryly. "All right, Thomas. You take care of the other arrangements and see that our friend here gets into no trouble. Now, gentlemen." Velli made his adieu monosyllabically and led the frightened stranger from the apartment. The inspector sat down. "Before we go over to Field's rooms, boys," he said thoughtfully, "I want to make certain things plain. In the first place, from what Benjamin Morgan has told us, Field's business was law, but his great source of income, blackmail. Did you know that, Tim? Monty Field sucked dozens of prominent men dry, in all likelihood to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. In fact, Tim, we're convinced that the motive behind Field's murder was connected with this phase of his undercover activities. There is no doubt but that he was killed by somebody who was being taken in for huge sums of hush money and could stand the gaff no longer. You know as well as I, Tim, that blackmail depends largely for its ugly life on the possession of incriminating documents by the blackmailer. That's why we're so sure that there are hidden papers about somewhere, and Ellery here maintains that they're in Field's rooms. Well, we'll see. If eventually we find those papers, the documents you've been hunting so long will probably come to light also, as Ellery pointed out a moment ago." He paused reflectively. "I can't tell you, Tim, how badly I want to get my hands on those confounded documents of Field's. They mean a good deal to me. They'd clear up a lot of questions about which we're still in the dark." "Well then, let's get going," cried Cronin, leaping from his chair. "Do you realize, Inspector, that I've worked for years on Field's tale for this one purpose? It will be the happiest day of my life, Inspector. Come on." Neither Ellery nor his father, however, seemed to be in haste. They retired to the bedroom to dress, while Cronin fretted in the living room. If Cronin had not been so preoccupied with his own thoughts, he would have noticed that the light spirits which had suffused the Queen's when he arrived were now scattered into black gloom. The inspector particularly seemed out of sorts, irritable, and for once slow to push the investigation into an inevitable channel. Eventually the Queens appeared fully dressed. The three men descended to the street. As they climbed into a taxicab, Ellery sighed. "Afraid you're going to be shown up, son?" muttered the old man, his nose buried in the folds of his topcoat. "I'm not thinking of that," returned Ellery. "It's something else. The papers will be found, never fear. "I hope to Christmas you're right," breathed Cronin fervently, and it was the last word spoken until the taxicab ground to a stop before the lofty apartment house on 75th Street. The three men took the elevator to the 4th floor and stepped out into the quiet corridor. The inspector peered about quickly, then punched the doorbell of the Field apartment. There was no answer, although they could hear the vague rustling of someone behind the door. Suddenly it swished open to reveal a red-faced policeman whose hand hovered uneasily in the region of his hip pocket. "Don't be scared, man. We won't bite you," growled the inspector, who was completely out of temper for no reason that Cronin, nervous and springy as a racing colt, could fathom. The uniformed man saluted. "Didn't know but it might be someone snooping around, Inspector," he said feebly. The three men walked into the foyer, the slim white hand of the old man pushing the door violently shut. "Anything been happening around here?" snapped Queen, striding to the entrance to the living room and looking inside. "Not a thing, sir," said the policeman. "I'm on 4-hour shifts with Cassidy as relief, and once in a while Detective Ritter drops in to see if everything is all right." "Oh, he does he?" The old man turned back. "Anybody try to get into the place?" "Not while I was here, Inspector, nor Cassidy either," responded the policeman nervously. "And we've been alternating ever since Tuesday morning. There hasn't been a soul near these rooms except Ritter." "Park out here in the foyer for the next couple of hours, officer," commanded the inspector. "Get yourself a chair and take a snooze if you want to. But if anybody should start monkeying with the door, tip us off pronto." The policeman dragged a chair from the living room into the foyer, sat down with his back against the front door, folded his arms, and unashamedly closed his eyes. The three men took in the scene with gloomy eyes. The foyer was small but crowded with oddments of furniture and decoration. A bookcase filled with unused-appearing volumes, a small table on which perched a modernistic lamp and some carved ivory ashtrays, 2 empire chairs, a peculiar piece of furniture which seemed half sideboard and half secretary, and a number of cushions and rugs were scattered about. The inspector stood regarding this melange wryly. "Here, son, I guess the best way for us to tackle the search is for the three of us to go through everything piece by piece, one checking up on the other. I'm not very hopeful about it, I'll tell you that." "The gentleman of the Wailing Wall," groaned Ellery. "Grief is writ fine and large on his noble visage." "You and I, Cronin, we're not such pessimists, are we?" Cronin growled. "I'd say less talk and more action, with all the respect in the world for these little family ructions." Ellery stared at him with admiration. "You're almost insectivorous in your determination, man. More like an army ant than a human being. And poor Field's lying in the morgue, too. Allons, enfant." They set to work under the nodding head of the policeman. They worked silently for the most part. Ellery's face reflected a calm expectancy, the inspector's a doleful irritation, Cronin's a savage indomitability. Book after book was extracted from the case and carefully inspected, leaves shaken out, covers examined minutely, backboards pinched and pierced. There were over 200 books, and the thorough search took a long time. Ellery, after a period of activity, seemed inclined to allow his father and Cronin to do the heavier work of inspection, while he devoted his attention more and more to the titles of the volumes. At one point he uttered a delighted exclamation and held up to the light a thin, cheaply bound book. Cronin leapt forward immediately, his eyes blazing. The inspector looked up with a flicker of interest. But Ellery had merely discovered another volume on handwriting analysis. The old man stared at his son in silent curiosity, his lips puckered thoughtfully. Cronin turned back to the bookcase with a groan. Ellery, however, riffling the pages rapidly, cried out again. The two men craned over his shoulder. On the margins of several pages were some penciled notations. The words spelled names: Henry Jones, John Smith, George Brown. They were repeated many times on the margins of the page, as if the writer were practicing different styles of penmanship. "Didn't Field have the most adolescent yen for scribbling?" asked Ellery, staring fascinatedly at the penciled names. "As usual, you have something up your sleeve, my son," remarked the inspector wearily. "I see what you mean, but I don't see that it helps us any, except for— By jinks, that's an idea." He bent forward and attacked the search once more, his body vibrant with fresh interest. Ellery, smiling, joined him. Cronin stared uncomprehendingly at both. "Suppose you let me in on this thing, folks?" he said in an aggrieved voice. The inspector straightened up. "Ellery's hit on something that, if it's true, is a bit of luck for us and reveals still another sidelight on Field's character. The black-hearted rascal. See here, Tim. If a man's an inveterate blackmailer and you find continual evidence that he has been practicing handwriting from textbooks on the subject, what conclusion would you draw?" "You mean that he's a forger, too?" frowned Cronin. "I never suspected that in spite of all these years of hounding him." "Not merely a forger, Cronin," laughed Ellery. "I don't think you'll find Monty Field has penned somebody else's name to a check or anything of that sort. He was too wily a bird to make such a grievous error. What he probably did do was secure original and incriminating documents referring to a certain individual, make copies of them, and sell the copies back to the owner, retaining the originals for further use." "And in that case, Tim," added the inspector portentously, "if we find this gold mine of papers somewhere about, which I greatly doubt, we'll also find, as like as not, the original or originals of the papers for which Monty Field was murdered." The red-haired assistant district attorney pulled a long face at his two companions. "Seems like a lot of ifs," he said finally, shaking his head. They resumed the search in growing silence. Nothing was concealed in the foyer. After an hour of steady, back-breaking work, they were forced reluctantly to that conclusion. Not a square inch was left unexamined. The interior of the lamp and of the bookcase, the slender thin-topped table, the secretary inside and outside, the cushions, even the walls were tapped carefully by the inspector, who by now was aroused to a high pitch of excitement, suppressed but remarkable in his tight lips and colored-touched cheeks. They attacked the living room. Their first port of call was the big clothes closet inside the room directly off the foyer. Again, the inspector and Ellery went through the topcoats, overcoats, and capes hanging on the rack. Nothing. On the shelf above were the 4 hats they had examined on Tuesday morning, the old Panama, the derby, and the 2 fedoras. Still nothing. Cronin bumped down on his knees to peer savagely into the darker recesses of the closet, tapping the wall, searching for signs of tampered woodwork. And still nothing. With the aid of a chair, the inspector poked into the corners of the area above the shelf. He climbed down, shaking his head. "Forget the closet, boys," he muttered. They descended upon the room proper. The large carved desk which Hagstrom and Pickett had rifled 3 days before invited their scrutiny. Inside was the pile of papers, canceled bills and letters they had offered for the old man's inspection. Old Queen actually peered through these torn and ragged sheets, as if they might conceal messages in invisible ink. He shrugged his shoulders and threw them down. "Darned if I'm not growing romantic in my old age," he growled. "The influence of a fiction-writing rascal of a son." He picked up the miscellaneous articles he himself had found on Tuesday in the pockets of the closet coats. Ellery was scowling now. Cronin was beginning to wear a forlorn, philosophical expression. The old man shuffled abstractedly among the keys, old letters, wallets, and then turned away. "Nothing in the desk," he announced wearily. "I doubt if that clever limb of Satan would have selected anything as obvious as a desk for a hiding place." "He would if he'd read his Edgar Allan Poe," murmured Ellery. "Let's get on. Sure there is no secret drawer here?" he asked Cronin. The red head was shaken sadly but emphatically. They probed and poked about in the furniture, under the carpets and lamps, in bookends, curtain rods. With each successive failure, the apparent hopelessness of the search was reflected in their faces. When they had finished with the living room, it looked as if it had innocently fallen into the path of a hurricane, a bare and comfortless satisfaction. "Nothing left but the bedroom, kitchenette, and lavatory," said the inspector to Cronin, and the three men went into the room which Mrs. Angela Russo had occupied Monday night. Field's bedroom was distinctly feminine in its accoutrements, a characteristic which Ellery ascribed to the influence of the charming Greenwich villager. Again they scoured the premises, not an inch of space eluding their vigilant eyes and questing hands, and again there seemed nothing to do but admit failure. They took apart the bedding and examined the spring of the bed. They put it together again and attacked the clothes closet. Every suit was mauled and crushed by their insistent fingers: bathrobes, dressing gowns, shoes, cravats. Cronin half-heartedly repeated his examination of the walls and moldings. They lifted rugs and picked up chairs, shook out the pages of the telephone book in the bedside telephone table. The inspector even lifted the metal disc which fitted around the steam pipe at the floor, because it was loose and seemed to present possibilities. From the bedroom they went into the kitchenette. It was so crowded with kitchen furnishings that they could barely move about. A large cabinet was rifled. Cronin's exasperated fingers dipped angrily into the flour and sugar bins. The stove, the dish closet, the pan closet, even the single marble washtub in a corner was methodically gone over. On the floor to one side stood the half-empty case of liquor bottles. Cronin cast longing glances in this direction, only to look guiltily away as the inspector glared at him. "And now the bathroom," murmured Ellery. In an ominous silence they trooped into the tiled lavatory. 3 minutes later they came out, still silently, and went into the living room, where they disposed themselves in chairs. The inspector drew out his snuff-box and took a vicious pinch. Cronin and Ellery lit cigarettes. "I should say, my son," said the inspector, in sepulchral tones, after a painful interval broken only by the snores of the policeman in the foyer, "I should say that the deductive method which has brought fame and fortune to Mr. Sherlock Holmes and his legions has gone awry. Mind you, I'm not scolding." But he slouched into the fastnesses of the chair. Ellery stroked his smooth jaw with nervous fingers. "I seem to have made something of an ass of myself," he confessed. "And yet those papers are here somewhere. Isn't it a silly notion to have? But logic bears me out. When 10 is the whole, and 2 plus 3 plus 4 are discarded, only 1 is left. Pardon me for being old-fashioned. I insist the papers are here." Cronin grunted and expelled a huge mouthful of smoke. "Your objection sustained," murmured Ellery, leaning back. "Let's go over the ground again." No, he explained hastily as Cronin's face lengthened in dismay. "I mean orally. Mr. Field's apartment consists of a foyer, a living room, a kitchenette, a bedroom, and a lavatory. We have fruitlessly examined a foyer, a living room, a kitchenette, a bedroom, and a lavatory. Euclid would regretfully force a conclusion here." He mused. "How have we examined these rooms?" he asked suddenly. "We have gone over the obvious things, pulled the obvious things to pieces. Furniture, lamps, carpets. I repeat, the obvious things. And we have tapped floors, walls, and molding. It would seem that nothing has escaped the search." He stopped, his eyes brightening. The inspector threw off his look of fatigue at once. From experience, he was aware that Ellery rarely grew excited over inconsequential things. "And yet," said Ellery slowly, gazing in fascination at his father's face. "By the golden roofs of Seneca, we've overlooked something. Actually overlooked something." "What?" growled Cronin. "You're kidding." "Oh, but I'm not," chuckled Ellery, lounging to his feet. "We have examined floors and we have examined walls, but have we examined ceilings?" He shot the word forth theatrically while the two men stared at him in amazement. "Here, what are you driving at, Ellery?" asked his father, frowning. Ellery briskly crushed his cigarette in an ashtray. "Just this," he said. "Pure reasoning has it that when you have exhausted every possibility but one in a given equation, that one, no matter how improbable, no matter how ridiculous it may seem in the postulation, must be the correct one. A theorem analogous to the one by which I concluded that the papers were in this apartment." "But, Mr. Queen, for the love of Pete, ceilings!" exploded Cronin, while the inspector looked guiltily at the living-room ceiling. Ellery caught the look and laughed, shaking his head. "I'm not suggesting that we call in a plasterer to maul these lovely middle-class ceilings," he said, "because I have the answer already. What is it in these rooms somewhere that is on the ceiling?" "The chandeliers," muttered Cronin doubtfully, gazing upward at the heavily bronzed fixture above their heads. "By jinks, the canopy over the bed!" shouted the inspector. He jumped to his feet and ran into the bedroom. Cronin pounded hard after him, Ellery sauntering interestedly behind. They stopped at the foot of the bed and stared up at the canopy. Unlike the conventional canopies of American style, this florid ornament was not merely a large square of cloth erected on 4 posts, an integral part of the bed only. The bed was so constructed that the 4 posts, beginning at the 4 corners, stretched from floor to ceiling. The heavy maroon-colored damask of the canopy also reached from floor to ceiling, connected at the top by a ringed rod from which the folds of the damask hung gracefully. "Well, if it's anywhere," grunted the inspector, dragging one of the damask-covered bedroom chairs to the bed, "it's up there. Here, boys, lend a hand." He stood on the chair with a fine disregard for the havoc his shoes were wreaking on the silken material. Finding upon stretching his arms above his head that he was still many feet short of touching the ceiling, he stepped down. "Doesn't look as if you could make it either, Ellery," he muttered. "And Field was no taller than you. There must be a ladder handy somewhere by which Field himself got up here." Cronin dashed into the kitchenette at Ellery's nod in that direction. He was back in a moment with a 6-foot step-ladder. The inspector, mounting to the highest rung, found that his fingers were still short of touching the rod. Ellery solved the difficulty by ordering his father down and climbing to the top himself. Standing on the ladder, he was in a position to explore the top of the canopy. He grasped the damask firmly and pulled. The entire fabric gave way and fell to the sides, revealing a wooden panel about 12 inches deep, a framework which the hangings had concealed. Ellery's fingers swept swiftly over the wooden relief work of this panel. Cronin and the inspector were staring with varying expressions up at him. Finding nothing that at the moment presented a possibility of entrance, Ellery leaned forward and explored the damask directly beneath the floor of the panel. "Rip it down," growled the inspector. Ellery jerked violently at the material, and the entire canopy of damask fell to the bed. The bare, unornamented floor of the panel was revealed. "It's hollow," announced Ellery, rapping his knuckles on the underside paneling. "That doesn't help much," said Cronin. "It wouldn't be a solid chunk anyway. Why don't you try the other side of the bed, Mr. Queen?" But Ellery, who had drawn back and was again examining the side of the panel, exclaimed triumphantly. He had been seeking a complicated Machiavellian secret door. He found now that the secret door was nothing more subtle than a sliding panel. It was cleverly concealed. The juncture of the sliding and stationary panels was covered by a row of wooden rosettes and clumsy decorations, but it was nothing that a student of mystery lore would have hailed as a triumph of concealment. "It begins to appear as if I were being vindicated," Ellery chuckled, as he peered into the black recesses of the hole he had uncovered. He thrust a long arm into the aperture. The inspector and Cronin were staring at him with bated breath. "By all the pagan gods!" shouted Ellery suddenly, his lean body quivering with excitement. "Do you remember what I told you, Dad? Where would those papers be except in hats?" His sleeve coated with dust, he withdrew his arm, and the two men below saw in his hand a musty silk top hat. Cronin executed an intricate jig as Ellery dropped the hat on the bed and dipped his arm once more into the yawning hole. In a moment he had brought out another hat, and still another. There they lay on the bed, 2 silk hats and 2 derbies. "Take this flashlight, son," commanded the inspector. "See if there's anything else up there." Ellery took the proffered electric torch and flashed its beam into the aperture. After a moment he clambered down, shaking his head. "That's all," he announced, dusting his sleeve. "But I should think it would be enough." The inspector picked up the 4 hats and carried them into the living room, where he deposited them on a sofa. The 3 men sat down gravely and regarded each other. "I'm sort of itching to see what's what," said Cronin finally in a hushed voice. "I'm rather afraid to look," retorted the inspector. "Mene mene tekel parsin," laughed Ellery. "In this case it might be interpreted as the handwriting on the panel. Examine on, Macduff." The inspector picked up one of the silk hats. It bore on the rich satiny lining the chaste trademark of Brown Brothers. Ripping out the lining and finding nothing beneath, he tried to tear out the leather sweatband. It resisted his mightiest efforts. He borrowed Cronin's pocket-knife and with difficulty slashed away the band. Then he looked up. "This hat, Romans and countrymen," he said pleasantly, "contains nothing but the familiar ingredients of hatware. Would you care to examine it?" Cronin uttered a savage cry and snatched it from the inspector's hand. He literally tore the hat to pieces in his rage. "Heck!" he said disgustedly, throwing the remnants on the floor. "Explain that to my undeveloped brain, will you, Inspector?" Queen smiled, taking up the second hat and regarding it curiously. "You're at a disadvantage, Tim," he said. "We know why one of these hats is a blank, don't we, Ellery?" "Michaels," murmured Ellery. "Exactly, Michaels," returned the inspector. "Charlie Michaels!" exclaimed Cronin. "Field's strong-arm guy, by all that's holy. Where does he come into this?" "Can't tell yet. Know anything about him?" "Nothing except that he hung on to Field's coattails pretty closely. He's an ex-jailbird, did you know that?" "Yes," replied the inspector dreamily. "We'll have a talk about that phase of Mr. Michaels some other time. But let me explain that hat. Michaels, on the evening of the murder, laid out, according to his statement, Field's evening clothes, including a silk hat. Michaels swore that, as far as he knew, Field possessed only one topper. Now, if we suppose that Field used hats for concealing papers, and was going to the Roman theater that night wearing a loaded one, he must necessarily have substituted the loaded hat for the empty one which Michaels prepared. Since he was so careful to keep only one silk hat in the closet, he realized that Michaels, should he find a topper, would be suspicious. So, in switching hats, he had to conceal the empty one. What more natural than that he should put it in the place from which he had taken the loaded hat, the panel above the bed? "Well, I'll be switched," exclaimed Cronin. "Finally," resumed the inspector, "we can take it as gospel that Field, who was devilishly careful in the matter of his headgear, intended to restore the theater hat to its hideaway when he got home from the Roman. Then he would have taken out this one, which you've just torn up, and put it back in the clothes closet. But let's get on." He pulled down the leather inner band of the second silk hat, which also bore the imprint of Brown Brothers. "Look at this, will you?" he exclaimed. The two men bent over and saw on the inner surface of the band, lettered with painful clarity in a purplish ink, the words Benjamin Morgan. "I've got to pledge you to secrecy, Tim," said the inspector immediately, turning to the red-haired man. "Never let on that you were a witness to the finding of papers in any way implicating Benjamin Morgan in this affair." "What do you think I am, Inspector?" growled Cronin. "I'm as dumb as an oyster, believe me." "All right, then." Queen felt the lining of the hat. There was a distinct crackle. "Now," remarked Ellery calmly, "we know for the first time definitely why the murderer had to take away the hat Field wore Monday night. In all likelihood, the murderer's name was lettered in the same way. That's indelible ink, you know, and the murderer couldn't leave a hat with his own name in it at the scene of the crime." "By gosh, if you only had that hat now," cried Cronin, "you'd know who the murderer is." "I'm afraid, Tim," replied the inspector dryly, "that hat is gone forever." He indicated a row of careful stitches at the base of the inner band, where the lining was attached to the fabric. He ripped these stitches swiftly and inserted his fingers between the lining and the crown. Silently, he drew out a sheaf of papers, held together by a thin rubber band. "If I were as nasty as some people think I am," mused Ellery, leaning back, "I might with perfect justice say, 'I told you so.'" "We know when we're licked, my son. Don't rub it in," chortled the inspector. He snapped off the rubber band, glanced hastily through the papers, and with a satisfied grin deposited them in his breast pocket. "Morgan's all right," he said briefly, and attacked one of the derbies. The inner side of the band was marked cryptically with an X. The inspector found a row of stitches exactly as in the silk hat. The papers he drew out, a thicker bundle than Morgan's, he examined cursorily. Then he handed them to Cronin, whose fingers were trembling. "A stroke of luck, Tim," he said slowly. "The man you were angling for is dead, but there are a lot of big names in this. I think you'll find yourself a hero one of these days." Cronin grasped the bundle and feverishly unfolded the papers one by one. "They're here! They're here!" he shouted. He jumped to his feet, stuffing the sheaf into his pocket. "I've got to beat it, Inspector," he said rapidly. "There's a load of work to do at last. And besides, what you find in that fourth hat is none of my business. I can't thank you and Mr. Queen enough. So long." He dashed from the room, and a moment later the snores of the policeman in the foyer came to an abrupt end. The outer door banged shut. Ellery and the inspector looked at each other. "I don't know what good this stuff is going to do us," grumbled the old man, fumbling with the inner band of the last hat, a derby. "We found things and deduced things and run rings around our imaginations. Well," he sighed as he held the band up to the light. It was marked MISC. End of Chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Roman Hat Mystery by Ellery Queen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18 Stalemate. At Friday noon, while Inspector Queen, Ellery, and Timothy Cronin were deep in their search of Montefield's rooms, Sergeant Velli, somber and unmoved as usual, walked slowly up 87th Street from Broadway, mounted the brownstone steps of the house in which the Queens lived, and rang the bell. Juna's cheery voice bade him ascend, which the good sergeant did with gravity. "Inspector's not home," announced Juna pertly, his slim body completely hidden behind an enormous housewife's apron. Odorous traces of an onion-covered steak pervaded the air. "Get on with you, you imp," growled Veli. He took from his inner breast pocket a bulky envelope, sealed, and handed it to Juna. "Give this to the inspector when he comes home. Forget, and I'll dip you into the East River." "You and who else?" breathed Juna, with a remarkable twitching of his lips. Then he added decorously, "Yes, sir." "All right, then." Veli deliberately turned about and descended to the street, where his broad back was visible in the formidable proportions to the grinning Juna from the fourth-story window. When, at a little before 6, the two queens trudged wearily into their rooms, the alert eyes of the inspector pounced upon the official envelope where it lay on his plate. He tore off a corner of the envelope and pulled out a number of typewritten sheets on the stationery of the Detective Bureau. "Well, well," he muttered to Ellery, who was lazily pulling off his topcoat. "The clans are gathering." Sinking into an armchair, his hat forgotten on his head, his coat still unbuttoned, he set about reading the reports aloud. The first slip read, "Report of release, 28 September, 1920-something. John Casanelli, alias Parson Johnny, alias John the Wop, alias Peter Dominic, released from custody today on parole. Undercover investigation of J.C.'s complicity in the robbery of the Bonomo silk mills, June 2nd, 1920-something, not successful. We are searching for Dinky Morehouse, police informer, who has disappeared from usual haunts for further information. Release effected under advice of District Attorney Sampson. J.C. under surveillance and is available at any time. TV." The second report which the inspector picked up, laying aside the advices concerning Parson Johnny with a frown, read as follows. Report on William Pusack, September 28, 1920-something. Investigation of the history of William Pusack reveals the following. 32 years old, born in Brooklyn, New York, of naturalized parents, unmarried, regular habits, socially inclined, has dates 3 or 4 nights a week, religious. Is bookkeeper at Stein & Roch, clothing merchants, 1076 Broadway. Does not gamble or drink. No evil companions. Only vice seems fondness for girls. Activities since Monday night normal. No letters sent, no money withdrawn from bank, hours fairly regular. No suspicious movements of any kind. Girl Esther Jablow seems Pusack's steadiest. Has seen E.J. twice since Monday. Twice at lunch, Wednesday evening. Went to movies and Chinese restaurant Wednesday evening. Operative number 4. Okayed TV. The inspector grunted as he threw the sheet aside. The third report was headed, Report on Madge O'Connell. To Friday, September 28th, 20-something. O'Connell lives at 1436 10th Avenue. Tenement, 4th floor. No father. Idle since Monday night, due to shutting down of Roman Theater. Left theater Monday night at general release of public. Went home, but stopped in drugstore, corner 8th Avenue and 48th Street, to telephone. Unable to trace call. Overheard reference to Parson Johnny in phone conversation. Seemed excited. Tuesday did not leave house until 1 o'clock. No attempt to get in touch with Parson Johnny at Tombs. Went around theater employment agencies looking for usherette position after finding out Roman Theater was closed indefinitely. Nothing new Wednesday all day or Thursday. Returned to work at Roman Thursday night after call from manager. No attempt to see or communicate with Parson Johnny. No incoming calls, no visitors, no mail. Seemed suspicious. Thinks she is wise to tailing. Operative number 11. Okayed TV. Humph, muttered the inspector as he picked up the next sheet of paper. Let's see what this one says. Report on Francis Ives Pope. September 28, 1920-something. FIP left Roman Theater Monday night directly after release from manager's office by Inspector Queen. Examined with other departing members of audience at main door. Left in company of Eve Ellis, Stephen Barry, Hilda Orange of the cast. Took taxi to Ives Pope House on Riverside Drive. Taken out in half-unconscious condition. 3 actors left house soon after. Tuesday she did not leave house. Learned from a gardener she was laid up in bed all day. Learned she received many calls during day. Did not appear formally until Wednesday morning at interview in house with Inspector Queen. After interview, left house in company of Stephen Barry, Eve Ellis, James Peel, her brother Stanford. Ives Pope limousine drove party out into Westchester. Outing revived F. Evening stayed at home with Stephen Barry. Bridge party on. Thursday went shopping on Fifth Avenue. Met Stephen Barry for luncheon. He took her to Central Park. Spent afternoon in Open. S.B. escorted her home before 5. S.B. stayed to dinner, leaving after dinner for work at Roman Theater on call from stage manager. F.I.P. spent evening at home with family. No report Friday morning. No suspicious actions all week. At no time accosted by strange persons. No communication from or to Benjamin Morgan. Operative number 39 okayed TV. "And that's that," murmured the inspector. The next report he selected was extremely short. Report on Oscar Lewin. September 28, 1920-something. Lewin spent all day Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday morning at office of Monty Field, working with Messrs. Stotz and Cronin. 3 men lunched together on each day. Lewin married, lives in Bronx, 211 East 156th Street. Spent every evening at home. No suspicious mail, no suspicious calls. No evil habits. Leads sober, modest life. Has good reputation. Operative number 16. Note: full details of Oscar Lewin's history, habits, etc. available on request through Timothy Cronin, Assistant District Attorney. TV. The inspector sighed as he deposited the 5 sheets of paper on his plate, rose, doffed his hat and coat, flung them into Juna's waiting arms, and sat down again. Then he picked up the last report from the contents of the envelope, a larger sheet to which was pinned a small slip marked Memorandum to R.Q. This slip read, "Dr. Prouty left the attached report with me this morning for transmission to you. He is sorry he could not report in person, but the Burbridge poison case is taking all his time." It was signed with Veli's familiar scrawling initials. The attached sheet was a hastily typewritten message on the letterhead of the chief medical examiner's office. "Dear Q," the message ran, "here's the dope on the tetraethyl lead. Jones and I have been superintending an exhaustive probe of all possible sources of dissemination. No success. And I think you can resign yourself to your fate in this respect. You'll never trace the poison that killed Monty Field. This is the opinion not merely of your humble servant, but of the chief and of Jones. We all agree that the most logical explanation is the gasoline theory. Try to trace that, Sherlocko." A postscript in Dr. Prouty's handwriting ran, "Of course, if anything turns up, I'll let you know immediately. Keep sober." "Fat lot of good that is," mumbled the inspector, as Ellery, without a word, attacked the aromatic and tempting meal that the priceless Juna had prepared. The inspector dug viciously into the fruit salad. He looked far from happy. He grumbled beneath his breath, cast baleful glances at the sheaf of reports by his plate, peered up at Ellery's tired face, and heartily munching jaws, and finally threw down his spoon altogether. "Of all the useless, exasperating, empty bunch of reports I ever saw," he growled. Ellery smiled. "You remember Periander, of course, eh? You might be polite, sir. Periander of Corinth, who said in a moment of sobriety, 'To industry nothing is impossible.'" With the fire roaring, Juna curled up on the floor in a corner, his favorite attitude. Ellery smoked a cigarette and stared comfortably into the flames, while old Queen crammed his nose vengefully with the contents of his snuff-box. The two Queens settled down to a serious discussion. To be more exact, Inspector Queen settled down and lent the tone of seriousness to the conversation, since Ellery seemed in a sublimely dreamy mood far removed from the sordid details of crime and punishment. The old man brought his hand down on the arm of his chair with a sharp slap. "Ellery, did you ever in your born days see a case so positively nerve-wracking?" "On the contrary," commented Ellery, staring with half-closed eyes into the fire, "you are developing a natural case of nerves. You allow little things like apprehending a murderer to upset you unduly. Pardon the hedonistic philosophy. If you will recall, in my story entitled The Affair of the Black Window, my good sleuths had no difficulty at all in laying their hands on the criminal. And why? Because they kept their heads. Conclusion: always keep your head. I'm thinking of tomorrow. Glorious vacation." "For an educated man, my son," growled the inspector petulantly, "you show a surprising lack of coherence. You say things that mean nothing and mean things when you say nothing. No, I'm all mixed up." Ellery burst into laughter. "The Maine woods, the russet, the good Chauvin's cabin by the lake, a rod, air, oh, Lord, won't tomorrow ever come?" Inspector Queen regarded his son with a pitiful eagerness. I sort of wish— well, never mind." He sighed. "All I do say, El, is that if my little burglar fails, it's all up with us." "To the blessed Gehenna with burglars!" cried Ellery. "What has Pan to do with human tribulation? My next book is as good as written, Dad." "Stealing another idea from real life, you rascal," muttered the old man. "If you're borrowing the field case for your plot, I'd be extremely interested to read your last few chapters." "Poor Dad," chuckled Ellery. "Don't take life so seriously. If you fail, you fail. Monty Field wasn't worth a hill of legumes anyway." "That's not the point," said the old man. "I hate to admit defeat. What a queer mess of motives and schemes this case is, Ellery. This is the first time in my entire experience that I have had such a hard nut to crack. It's enough to give a man apoplexy. I know who committed the murder. I know why the murder was committed. I even know how the murder was committed. And where am I?" He paused and savagely took a pinch of snuff. "1,000,000 miles from nowhere, that's where," he growled and subsided. "Certainly a most unusual situation," murmured Ellery. "Yet more difficult things have been accomplished. Hi-oh, I can't wait to bathe myself in that Arcadian stream." "And get pneumonia, probably," said the inspector anxiously. "You promise me now, young man, that you don't do any back-to-nature stunts out there. I don't want a funeral on my hands. Ellery grew silent suddenly. He looked over at his father. The inspector seemed strangely old in the flickering light of the fire. An expression of pain humanized the deeply sculptured lines of his face. His hand, brushing back his thick gray hair, looked alarmingly fragile. Ellery rose, hesitated, colored, then bent swiftly forward and patted his father on the shoulder. "Brace up, Dad," he said in a low voice. "If it weren't for my arrangements with Chauvin, everything will be all right. Take my word for it. If there were the slightest way in which I could help you by remaining, but there isn't. It's your job now, Dad, and there's no man in the world who can handle it better than you." The old man stared up at him with a strange affection. Ellery turned abruptly away. "Well," he said lightly, "I'll have to pack now if I expect to make the 7:45 out of Grand Central tomorrow morning." He disappeared into the bedroom. Juna, who had been sitting Turkish-wise in his corner, got quietly to his feet and crossed the room to the inspector's chair. He slipped to the floor, his head resting against the old man's knees. The silence was punctuated by the snapping of wood in the fireplace and the muffled sounds of Ellery moving about in the next room. Inspector Queen was very tired. His face, worn, thin, white, lined, was like a cameo in the dull red light. His hand caressed Juna's curly head. "Juna, lad," he muttered, "never be a policeman when you grow up." Juna twisted his neck and stared gravely at the old man. "I'm going to be just what you are," he announced. The old man leapt to his feet as the telephone bell rang. He snatched the instrument from its table, his face livid, and said in a choked voice, "Queen speaking. Well?" After a time he put down the phone and trudged across the room toward the bedroom. He leaned against the lintel heavily. Ellery straightened up from his suitcase and jumped forward. "Dad," he cried, "what's the matter?" The inspector essayed a feeble smile. "Just a little tired, son, I guess," he grunted. "I just heard from our housebreaker." "And?" "He found absolutely nothing." Ellery gripped his father's arm and led him to the chair by the bed. The old man slumped into it, his eyes ineffably weary. "Ellery, old son," he said, "the last shred of evidence is gone. It's maddening. Not a morsel of physical, tangible evidence that would convict the murderer in court. What have we? A series of perfectly sound deductions. And that's all. A good lawyer would make Swiss cheese out of our case. Well, the last word hasn't been spoken yet," he added with a sudden grimness as he rose from the chair. He pounded Ellery's broad back in returning vigor. "Get to bed, son," he said. "You've got to get up early tomorrow morning. I'm going to sit up and think." End of Chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Roman Hat Mystery by Ellery Queen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interlude, in which the reader's attention is respectfully requested. The current vogue in detective literature is all for the practice of placing the reader in the position of chief sleuth. I have prevailed upon Mr. Ellery Queen to permit at this point in the Roman Hat Mystery the interpolation of a challenge to the reader. Who killed Monty Field? How was the murder accomplished? Mr. Queen agrees with me that the alert student of mystery tales, now being in possession of all the pertinent facts, should at this stage of the story have reached definite conclusions on the questions propounded. The solution, or enough of it to point unerringly to the guilty character, may be reached by a series of logical deductions and psychological observations. In closing my last personal appearance in the tale, let me admonish the reader with a variation of the phrase caveat emptor, let the reader beware. J. J. McC. Part 4. The perfect criminal is a superman. He must be meticulous in his technique, unseen, unseeable, a lone wolf. He must have neither friends nor dependents. He must be careful to a fault, quick of brain, hand, and foot. But these are nothing. There have been such men. On the other hand, he must be a favored child of fate, for circumstances over which he cannot have the remotest control must never contrive his downfall. This, I think, is more difficult to achieve. But the last is most difficult of all. He must never repeat his crime, his weapon, or his motive. In all my 20 years as an official of the American police, I have not once encountered the perfect criminal nor investigated the perfect crime. From American Crime and Methods of Detection by Richard Queen. Chapter 19, in which Inspector Queen conducts more legal conversations. It was notable, particularly to District Attorney Sampson, that on Saturday evening Inspector Richard Queen was far from being himself. The old man was irritable, snappish, and utterly uncongenial. He paced fretfully across the carpet of Manager Louis Panzer's office, biting his lips and muttering beneath his breath. He seemed oblivious to the presence of Samson, Panzer, and a third person who had never been in that theatrical sanctum before and was seated mouse-like in one of Panzer's big chairs, his eyes like saucers. This was bright-eyed Juna, granted the unprecedented privilege of accompanying his gray patron on this latest incursion into the Roman theater. In truth, Queen was singularly depressed. He had many times in his official life been confronted by apparently insoluble problems. He had as many times brought triumph out of failure. The inspector's strange manner, therefore, was doubly inexplicable to Samson, who had been associated with the old man for years and had never seen him so completely unstrung. The old man's moodiness was not due to the progress of the field investigation, as Samson worriedly thought. Wiry little Juna, sitting open-mouthed in his corner, was the only spectator to the inspector's mad pacing who could have put his finger on the truth. Juna, wise by virtue of gammon perspicacity, observant by nature, familiar with Queen's temperament through a loving association, knew that his patron's manner was due solely to Ellery's absence from the scene. Ellery had left New York on the 7:45 express that morning, having been gloomily accompanied to the station by his father. At the last moment, the younger man had changed his mind, announcing his decision to forego the trip to Maine and abide in New York by his father's side until the case was concluded. The old man would have none of it. With his shrewd insight into Ellery's nature, he realized how keenly his highly strung son had been looking forward to this first vacation in over a year. It was not in his heart, impatient as he was for the constant presence of his son, to deprive him of this long-contemplated pleasure trip. Accordingly, he had swept aside Ellery's proposal and pushed him up the steps of the train, with a parting clap and a wan smile. Ellery's last words, shouted from the platform as the train glided out of the station, were, "I'm not forgetting you, Dad. You'll hear from me sooner than you expect." Now, torturing the nap of Manager Panzer's rug, the inspector was feeling the full impact of their separation. His brain was addled, his constitution flabby, his stomach weak, his eyes dim. He felt completely out of tune with the world and its denizens, and he made no attempt to conceal his irritation. "Should be about time now, Panzer," he growled to the stout little manager. "How long does this infernal audience take to clear out, anyway?" "In a moment, Inspector, in a moment," replied Panzer. The district attorney sniffed away the remnants of his cold. Juna stared in fascination at his god. A rap on the door twisted their heads about. Tow-headed Harry Nielsen, the publicity man, poked his rugged face into the room. "Mind if I join the little party, Inspector?" he inquired cheerfully. "I was in at the birth, and if there's going to be a death, why, I'm aiming to stick around, with your permission." The inspector shot him a dour glare from beneath his shaggy eyebrows. He stood in a Napoleonic attitude, his every hair and muscle bristling with ill nature. Samson regarded him in surprise. Inspector Queen was showing an unexpected side to his temper. "Might's well," he barked. "One more won't hurt. There's an army here as it is." Nielsen reddened slightly and made a move as if to withdraw. The inspector's eye twinkled with a partial return to good spirits. "Here, sit down, Nielsen," he said, not unkindly. "Mustn't mind an old fogey like me. I'm just frazzled a bit. Might need you tonight at that." "Glad to be let in on it, Inspector," grinned Nielsen. "What's the idea? Sort of Spanish Inquisition?" "Just about." The old man bent his brows. "But we'll see." At this moment the door opened, and the tall, broad figure of Sergeant Velli stepped quickly into the room. He was carrying a sheet of paper, which he handed to the inspector. "All present, sir," he said. "Everybody out?" snapped Queen. "Yes, sir. I've told the cleaning women to go down into the lounge and hang around until we're through. Cashiers have gone home, so we have the ushers and usherettes. Cast is backstage, I guess, getting dressed." "All right, let's go, gentlemen." The inspector stalked out of the room, followed closely by Juna, who had not opened his mouth all evening except to emit noiseless gasps of admiration, for no reason that the amused district attorney could see. Panzer, Sampson, and Nielsen also followed, Veli bringing up the rear. The auditorium was again a vast and deserted place, the empty rows of seats stark and cold. The lights of the theater had been switched on in full, and their cold radiance lit up every corner of the orchestra. As the 5 men and Juna swung toward the extreme left aisle, there was a concerted bobbing of heads from the left section of seats. It was apparent now that a small group of people were awaiting the arrival of the inspector, who walked heavily down the aisle and took up a position in front of the left boxes, so that all the seated people faced him. Panzer, Nielsen, and Sampson stood at the head of the aisle, with Juna at one side, a feverish spectator. The assembled party was placed peculiarly. From the row nearest the inspector, who stood about halfway down the orchestra, and proceeding towards the rear, the only seats occupied were those directly on the left aisle. The end 2 seats of the dozen rows were filled by a motley aggregation, men and women, old and young. They were the same people who had occupied these chairs on the night of the fatal performance, and whom Inspector Queen had personally examined after the discovery of the body. In the section of 8 seats, Monty Fields and the empty ones which had surrounded it, were grouped William Pusack, Esther Jablow, Madge O'Connell, Jess Lynch, and Parson Johnny, the parson furtive-eyed, uneasy, and whispering to the usherette behind nicotined fingers. At the inspector's sudden gesture, all became silent as the grave. Sampson, looking about him at the bright chandeliers and lights, the deserted theater, the lowered curtain, could not help feeling that the stage was being set for dramatic revelations. He leaned forward interestedly. Panzer and Nielsen were quiet and watchful. Juna kept his eyes fixed on the old man. "Ladies and gentlemen," Queen announced curtly, staring at the assembled company, "I brought you here for a definite purpose. I will not keep you any longer than is absolutely necessary, but what is necessary and what is not necessary is entirely up to me. If I find that I do not receive what I consider truthful answers to my questions, everybody will stay here until I am satisfied. I want that thoroughly understood before we proceed." He paused and glared about. There was a ripple of apprehension, a sudden crackle of conversation which died as quickly as it was born. "On Monday night," continued the inspector frostily, "you people attended the performance at this theater, and, with the exception of certain employees and others now seated at the rear, occupied the seats in which you now find yourselves." Sampson grinned as he noticed the stiffening of backs at these words, as if each individual felt his seat grow suddenly warm and uncomfortable beneath him. "I want you to imagine that this is Monday night. I want you to think back to that night and try to remember everything that happened. By everything, I mean any occurrence, no matter how trivial or apparently unimportant, that might have left an impression on your memory." As the inspector warmed to his words, a number of people drifted into the orchestra at the rear. Sampson greeted them in whispers. The little party was composed of Eve Ellis, Hilda Orange, Stephen Barry, James Peel, and 3 or 4 other members of the cast of Gunplay. They were dressed in their street clothes. Peel whispered to Sampson that they had just come from their dressing rooms and had dropped into the auditorium on hearing voices. "Queen's holding a little powwow," whispered Sampson in return. "Do you think the inspector has any objections to our staying a while and listening?" asked Barry in a low tone, with an apprehensive glance toward the inspector, who had stopped and was staring icily in their direction. "Don't see why," began Sampson worriedly, when Eve Ellis murmured, "Shh," and they all became silent. "Now," said the inspector venomously, when the flurry had subsided, "this is the situation. Remember, you are now back in Monday evening. The curtain has gone up on the second act, and the theater is dark. There is a lot of noise from the stage, and you are intent on the exciting sequences of the play. Did any of you, especially those sitting in the aisle seats, notice anything peculiar, unusual, or disturbing around or near you at that time?" He paused expectantly. There were puzzled, fearful shakings of the head. No one answered. "Think hard," growled the inspector. "You remember on Monday night I went down this aisle and questioned all of you in the same vein. Naturally, I don't want lies, and I can't reasonably expect that you will tell me something startling now when you could remember nothing Monday night. But this is a desperate situation. A man was murdered here, and we are frankly up against it. One of the most difficult cases we have ever encountered. In light of such a condition, when we find ourselves against a blank wall with not the slightest idea where to turn, I am being honest with you, and I expect you to be with me. I must turn to you as the only members of the audience 5 nights ago who were in a position to see something important, if anything important occurred. It has been my experience that often, under stress of nervousness and excitement, a man or woman will forget a little detail that returns to memory after a few hours, days, weeks of normalcy. It is my hope that something of the sort has taken place with you." As Inspector Queen spoke, the words dropping acidly from his lips, the company lost its nervousness in its fascinated interest. When he paused, people put their heads together and whispered excitedly, shaking their heads at times, arguing in fierce, low tones at others. The inspector waited in a resigned patience. "Raise your hands if you have something to tell me," he said. A woman's timid white hand fluttered aloft. "Yes, madam," commanded Queen, pointing his finger. "Do you recall anything unusual?" A withered old lady rose embarrassedly to her feet and began to stammer in a squeaking voice. "I don't know whether it's important or not, sir," she said tremulously, "but I do remember sometime during the second act, a woman, I think it was, walking down the aisle and a few seconds later walking up again." "Yes, that's interesting, madam," commented the inspector. "About what time was this? Can you recall?" "I don't remember the time, sir," shrilled the old lady, "but it was about 10 minutes or so after the beginning of the act." "I see. And do you recall anything of her appearance? Was she young or old? What did she wear?" The old lady looked troubled. "I don't exactly remember, sir," she quavered. "I wasn't paying—" A high, clear voice interrupted from the rear. Heads twisted about. Madge O'Connell had jumped to her feet. "You don't have to mess around with that any more, Inspector," she announced coldly. "That lady saw me walking down the aisle and back again. That was before you know." She winked pertly in the inspector's direction. People gasped. The old lady stared with pitiful bewilderment at the usherette, then at the inspector, and finally sat down. "I'm not surprised," said the inspector quietly. "Well, anybody else?" There was no answer. Realizing that the company might feel shy of announcing their thoughts in public, Queen started up the aisle, working from row to row, questioning each person separately in tones inaudible to the rest. When he had finished, he returned slowly to his original position. "I see that I must allow you, ladies and gentlemen, to return to your peaceful firesides. Thank you very much for your help. Dismissed." He flung the word at them. They stared at him dazedly, then rose in muttering groups, took up their coats and hats, and under Veli's stern eye, began to file out of the theater. Hilda Orange, standing in the group behind the last row, sighed. "It's almost embarrassing to see that poor old gentleman's disappointment," she whispered to the others. "Come on, folks, let's be going too." The actors and actresses left the theater among the departing company. When the last man and woman had disappeared, the inspector marched back up the aisle and stood gloomily staring at the little group who were left. They seemed to sense the seething fire in the old man, and they cowered. but the inspector, with a characteristic lightning change of front, became human again. He sat down in one of the seats and folded his arms over the back, surveying Madge O'Connell, Parson Johnny, and the others. "All right, folks," he said in a genial tone. "How about you, Parson? You're a free man. You don't have to worry about silks any more, and you can speak up now like any self-respecting citizen. Can you give us any help in this affair?" "Nah," grunted the little gangster. "I told you all I knew. Ain't got a thing to say." "I see. You know, Parson, that we're interested in your dealings with Field." The gangster looked up in shocked surprise. "Oh, yes," continued the inspector. "We want you to tell us sometime about your business with Mr. Field in the past. You'll keep that in mind, won't you?" "Parson," he said sharply, "who killed Monty Field? Who had it in for him? If you know, out with it." "Oh, Inspector," the parson whined, "you ain't pulling that stuff on me again, are you? How should I know? Field was one slick guy. He didn't go around welching on his enemies. No, sir, I wouldn't know. He was pretty good to me. Got me off on a couple of charges," he admitted unblushingly. "But I didn't have no more idea he was here Monday night than anything." The inspector turned to Madge O'Connell. "How about you, O'Connell?" he asked softly. "My son, Mr. Queen, tells me that on Monday night you confided in him about closing the exit doors. You didn't say anything to me about that. What do you know?" The girl returned his stare coolly. "I told you once, Inspector. I haven't a thing to say." "And you, William Pusack," Queen turned to the weazen little bookkeeper. "Do you remember anything now that you forgot Monday night?" Pusack wriggled uncomfortably. "Meant to tell you, Inspector," he mumbled. "And when I read about it in the papers, it came back to me. As I bent over Mr. Field Monday night, I smelled a terrible smell of whiskey. I don't remember if I told you that before." "Thank you," remarked the inspector dryly, rising. "A very important contribution to our little investigation. You may go, the whole lot of you." The orangeade boy, Jess Lynch, looked disappointed. "Don't you want to talk to me too, sir?" he asked anxiously. The inspector smiled despite his abstraction. "Ah, yes, the helpful purveyor of orangeade. And what have you to say, Jess?" "Well, sir, before this fellow Field came over to my stand to ask for the ginger ale, I happened to notice that he picked up something in the alleyway," said the boy eagerly. "It was shiny, sort of, but I couldn't see it clear enough. He put it in his hip pocket right away," he concluded triumphantly, glancing about him as if to invite applause. The inspector seemed interested enough. "What was this shiny object like, Jess?" he inquired. "Might it have been a revolver?" "Revolver? Gosh, I don't think so," said the orangeade boy doubtfully. "It was square, like—" "Might it have been a woman's purse?" interrupted the inspector. The boy's face brightened. "That's it!" he cried. "I'll bet that's what it was. Shined all over, like colored stones." Queen sighed. "Very good, Lynch," he said. "You go home now like a good boy." Silently, the gangster, the usherette, Pusack and his feminine charge, and the orangeade boy rose and departed. Velly accompanied them to the outer door. Sampson waited until they had gone before he took the inspector to one side. "What's the matter, Q?" he demanded. "Aren't things going right?" "Henry, my boy," smiled the inspector, "we've done as much as mortal brains could. Just a little more time. I wish—" He did not say what he wished. He grasped Juna firmly by the arm, and bidding Panzer, Nielsen, Velly, and the district attorney a placid good night, left the theater. At the apartment, as the inspector wielded his key and the door swung open, Juna pounced on a yellow envelope lying on the floor. It had evidently been stuck through the crack at the bottom of the door. Juna flourished it in the old man's face. "It's from Mr. Ellery, I bet," he cried. "I knew he wouldn't forget." He seemed more extraordinarily like a monkey than ever as he stood grinning, the telegram in his hand. The inspector snatched the envelope from Juna's hand, and not pausing to take off his hat or coat, switched on the lights in the living room and eagerly extracted the yellow slip of paper. Juna had been correct. "Arrived safely," it ran. "Chauvin wild with delight, fishing prospect exceptional. Stop. Think I have solved your little problem. Stop. Join distinguished company of Rabelais, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Dryden, who said, 'Make a virtue of necessity.' Stop. Why not go into blackmailing business yourself? Stop. Don't growl Juna to death. Affectionately, Ellery." The inspector stared down at the harmless yellow slip, a startled comprehension transmuting the harsh lines of his face. He whirled on Juna, clapped that young gentleman's cap on his tousled head, and pulled his arm purposefully. "Juna, old son," he said gleefully, "let's go around the corner and celebrate with a couple of ice cream sodas." End of Chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Roman Hat Mystery by Ellery Queen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20, in which Mr. Michaels writes a letter. For the first time in a week, Inspector Queen was genuinely himself as he strode cheerfully into his tiny office at the headquarters building and shed his coat at a chair. It was Monday morning. He rubbed his hands, hummed the sidewalks of New York as he plumped down at his desk and briskly ran through his voluminous mail and reports. He spent a half-hour issuing instructions by word of mouth and telephone to subordinates in various offices of the Detective Bureau, studied briefly a number of reports which a stenographer placed before him, and finally pressed one of a row of buttons on his desk. Velli appeared at once. "Howdy, Thomas," said the inspector heartily. "How are you this fine fall morning?" Velli permitted himself a smile. "Well enough, Inspector," he said. "And you? You seemed a little under the weather Saturday night." The inspector chuckled. "Let bygones be bygones, Thomas, my lad. Juna and I visited the Bronx Zoo yesterday and spent a delightful 4 hours among our brethren, the animals." "That imp of yours was in his element, I bet," growled Velli. "Among the monkeys especially." Now, Thomas," chided the inspector, "don't be mistaken about Juna. He's a smart little whippersnapper. Going to be a great man some day, mark my words." "Juna?" Velli nodded gravely. "Guess you're right, Inspector. I'd give my right paw for that kid. What's the program today, sir?" "There's a lot on the program today, Thomas," Queen said mysteriously. "Did you get hold of Michaels after I telephoned you yesterday morning?" "Sure thing, Inspector. He's been waiting outside for an hour. Came in early, with Piggott hanging on his heels. Piggott's been tailing him all over creation, and he's pretty disgusted." "Well, I always said a man's a fool to become a policeman," chuckled Queen. "Bring in the lamb." Velli went out to reappear a moment later with the tall, portly Michaels. Field's valet was dressed somberly. He seemed nervous and ill at ease. "Now, Thomas, my lad," said the inspector, after he had motioned Michaels to the chair beside his desk, "you go out and lock that door, and don't let the commissioner himself disturb me. Get that?" Velli repressed a curious glance, grunted, and departed. A few moments later, a bulky figure was dimly discernible in silhouette through the frosted glass of the door. At the expiration of a half-hour, Velli was summoned by telephone to his superior's office. He unlocked the door. On the desk before the inspector reposed a cheap square envelope, unsealed, a sheet of notepaper partly visible as it lay inside. Michaels was on his feet, pale and trembling, his hat crushed in two beefy hands. Veli's sharp eyes noticed a generous ink stain on the fingers of the man's left hand. "You are going to take very good care of Mr. Michaels, Thomas," said the inspector genially. "Today, for instance, I want you to entertain him. I have no doubt you'll find something to do. Go to a movie. There's an idea. In any event, be friendly with the gentleman until you hear from me. No communication with anybody, Michaels, do you hear?" he added brusquely, turning to the big man. "Just you tag along with Sergeant Veli and play nicely." "You know I'm on the square, Inspector," mumbled Michaels sullenly. "You don't have to." "Just a precaution, Michaels, just an elementary precaution," interrupted the inspector, smiling. "Have a nice time, boys." The two men left. Seated at his desk, Queen tilted his swivel chair, picked up the envelope before him reflectively, took out the slip of cheap white paper, and read it over with a little smile. The note bore neither date nor salutation. The message began abruptly. "The writer is Charles Michaels. I think you know me. I have been Monty Field's right-hand man for over 2 years. I won't beat around the bush. Last Monday night, you killed Field in the Roman Theater. Monty Field told me Sunday he had an appointment with you at the theater, and I am the only one who does know this. Another thing, I also know why you killed him. You put him away to get hold of the papers in Field's hat. But you do not know that the papers you stole from him are not the originals. To prove this to you, I am enclosing one sheet from the testimony of Nellie Johnson, which was in Field's possession. If the papers you took from Field's hat are still in existence, compare what you have with this one. You will soon see that I am giving you the straight goods, and I have the rest of the originals safely put away where you will never lay hands on them. I might say that the police are looking for them with their tongues hanging out. Wouldn't it be nice if I stepped into Inspector Queen's office with the papers and my little story? I will give you a chance to buy these papers. You can bring $25,000 in cold cash to the place I describe, and I will hand them over to you. I need money, and you need the papers and my silence. Meet me tomorrow, Tuesday night, at 12 o'clock, at the 7th bench on the right-hand side of the paved path in Central Park, which starts at the northwest corner of 59th Street and 5th Avenue. I will be dressed in a gray overcoat and a gray slouch hat. Just say the word papers to me. This is the only way you can get the papers. Don't look for me before the appointment. If you are not there, I know what I have to do." The scrawl, closely and painfully written, was signed Charles Michaels. Inspector Queen sighed, licked the flap of the envelope, and sealed it. He stared steadily at the name and address written in the same handwriting on the envelope. Unhurriedly, he affixed a stamp on one corner. He pressed another button. The door opened to admit Detective Ritter. "Good morning, Inspector." "Morning, Ritter." The inspector weighed the envelope reflectively in his hand. "What are you working on now?" The detective shuffled his feet. "Nothing special, Inspector. I was helping Sergeant Veli up to Saturday, but I haven't had any work yet on the Field case this morning." "Well, then, I'll give you a nice little job." The inspector suddenly grinned, holding out the envelope. Ritter took it with a bewildered air. "Here, son, go to the corner of 149th Street and 3rd Avenue and post this letter in the nearest mailbox." Ritter stared, scratched his head, looked at Queen, and finally went out, depositing the letter in his pocket. The inspector tilted his chair and took a pinch of snuff with every evidence of satisfaction. End of Chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Roman Hat Mystery by Ellery Queen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21, in which Inspector Queen makes a capture. On Tuesday evening, October 2nd, promptly at 11:30 p.m., a tall man wearing a soft black hat and a black overcoat, the collar pulled up around his face to keep out the raw night air, sauntered out of the lobby of a small hotel on 53rd Street near 7th Avenue and proceeded at a sharp pace up 7th Avenue toward Central Park. Arrived at 59th Street, he turned to the east and made his way along the deserted thoroughfare in the direction of 5th Avenue. When he reached the 5th Avenue entrance to Central Park off the Plaza Circle, he stopped in the shadow of one of the big concrete corner posts and leaned back idly. As he lit a cigarette, the flare from the match illumined his face. It was that of an elderly man, a trifle lined. A grizzled mustache drooped in a straggling line from his upper lip. Under his hat a gray patch of hair was visible. Then the light from the match flickered out. He stood quietly against the concrete post, hands jammed into his overcoat pockets, puffing away at his cigarette. An observer would have noticed, had he been keen, that the man's fingers trembled slightly and that his black shod feet tapped the sidewalk in an unsteady tattoo. When his cigarette burned down, he threw it away and glanced at a watch on his wrist. The hand stood at 11:50. He swore impatiently and stepped past the portals of the park entrance. The light from the overhead arcs bordering the plaza dimmed as he walked up the stone lane. Hesitating, as if he were undecided as to his course of action, he looked about him, considered for a moment, then crossed over to the first bench and sat down heavily, like a man tired from his day's work and contemplating a restful quarter of an hour in the silence and darkness of the park. Slowly his head drooped. Slowly his figure grew slack. He seemed to have fallen into a doze. The minutes ticked away. No one passed the quiet figure of the black-clad man as he sat on his bench. On 5th Avenue the motors roared past. The shrill whistle of the traffic officer in the plaza pierced the chill air periodically. A cold wind soughed through the trees. From somewhere in the Stygian recesses of the park came a girl's clear laugh, soft and far off, but startlingly distinct. The minutes drowsed on. The man was falling into a deeper sleep. And yet, just as the bells of the neighborhood churches began to toll the hour of 12, the figure tensed, waited an instant, and then rose determinedly. Instead of heading toward the entrance, he turned and plodded farther up the walk, his eyes bright and inquisitive in the gloomy depths created by his hat brim and coat collar. He seemed to be counting the benches as he proceeded in a steady, unhurried gait. 2, 3, 4, 5. He stopped. In the semi-darkness ahead, he could barely make out a still gray figure seated on a bench. The man walked slowly on. 6, 7. He did not pause, but went straight ahead. 8, 9, 10. Only then did he wheel and retrace his steps. This time his gait was brisker, more definite. He approached the 7th bench rapidly, then stopped short. Suddenly, as if he had made up his mind, he crossed over to the spot where the indistinctly looming figure rested quietly and sat down. The figure grunted and moved over a trifle to give the newcomer more room. The two men sat in silence. After a time, the black-garbed man dipped into the folds of his coat and produced a packet of cigarettes. He lit one and held the match for a moment after the tip of the cigarette glowed red. In the ray of the matchlight, he covertly examined the quiet man at his side. The brief moment told him little. The occupant of the bench was as well muffled and concealed as himself. Then the light puffed out, and they were in darkness once more. The black-coated man seemed to come to a decision. He leaned forward, tapped the other man sharply on the knee, and said in a low, husky voice the one word, "Papers." The second man came to life immediately. He half shifted his position, scrutinized his companion, and grunted as if in satisfaction. He carefully leaned away from the other man on the bench, and with his right gloved hand dug into his right overcoat pocket. The first man bent eagerly forward, his eyes bright. The gloved hand of his companion came out of the pocket, holding something tightly. Then the owner of the hand did a surprising thing. With a fierce bunching of muscles, he sprang from the bench and leapt backward, away from the first man. At the same time, he leveled his right hand straight at the crouched, frozen figure, and a fragmentary gleam of light from an arc lamp far off revealed the thing he held in his hand, a revolver. Crying out hoarsely, the first man sprang to his feet with the agility of a cat. His hand plunged with a lightning-like movement into his overcoat pocket. He darted, reckless of the weapon pointed at his heart, straight forward at the tense figure before him. But things were happening. The peaceful tableau, so suggestive a bare instant before of open spaces and dark country silence, was transformed magically into a scene of intense activity, a writhing, yelling pandemonium. From a cluster of bushes a few feet behind the bench, a swiftly moving group of men with drawn guns materialized. At the same time, from the farther side of the walk, a similar group appeared, running toward the pair. And from both ends of the walk, from the entrance about 100 feet away and from the opposite direction, in the blackness of the park, came several uniformed policemen, brandishing revolvers. The four groups converged almost as one. The man who had drawn his gun and leapt from the bench did not await the arrival of reinforcements. As his companion of a moment before plunged his hand into his coat pocket, the gun-wielder took careful aim and fired. The weapon roared, awakening echoes in the park. An orange flame streaked into the body of the black-coated man. He lurched forward, clutching his shoulder spasmodically. His knees buckled, and he fell to the stone walk. His hand still fumbled in his coat. But an avalanche of men's bodies kept him from whatever furious purpose was in his mind. Ungentle fingers gripped his arms and pinned them down, so that he could not withdraw his hand from his pocket. They held him in this way, silently, until a crisp voice behind them said, "Careful, boys, watch his hands." Inspector Richard Queen wriggled into the hard-breathing group and stood contemplatively above the writhing figure on the pavement. "Take his hand out, Velly. Easy now. Hold it stiff, and stiff, man, stiff. He'd jab you in a flash." Sergeant Thomas Velly, who was straining at the arm, gingerly pulled it from the pocket despite the violent flounderings of the man's body. The hand appeared, empty, muscles loosened at the last moment. Two men promptly fastened it in a vise. Velly made a movement as if to explore the pocket. The inspector stopped him with a sharp word, and himself bent over the threshing man on the walk. Carefully, delicately, as if his life depended upon caution, the old man lowered his hand into the pocket and felt about its exterior. He gripped something and just as cautiously withdrew it, holding it up to the light. It was a hypodermic needle. The light of the arc lamp made its pale, limpid contents sparkle. Inspector Queen grinned as he knelt by the wounded man's side. He jerked off the black felt hat. "Disguised and everything," he murmured. He snatched at the gray mustache, passed his hand rapidly over the man's lined face. A smudge immediately appeared on the skin. "Well, well," said the inspector softly as the man's feverish eyes glared up at him. "Happy to meet you again, Mr. Stephen Barry, and your good friend, Mr. Tetraethyl-Lead." End of Chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Roman Hat Mystery by Ellery Queen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22, and explains. Inspector Queen sat at the writing desk in his living room, scribbling industriously on a long narrow sheet of notepaper headed "The Queens." It was Wednesday morning, a fair Wednesday morning, with the sun streaming into the room through the dormer windows and the cheerful noises of 87th Street faintly audible from the pavements below. The inspector wore his dressing gown and slippers. Juna was busy at the table clearing away the breakfast dishes. The old man had written, "Dear son, as I wired you late last night, the case is finished. We got Stephen Barry very nicely by using Michael's name and handwriting as bait. I really ought to congratulate myself on the psychological soundness of the plan. Barry was desperate, and like so many other criminals, thought he could duplicate his crime without being caught. I hate to tell you how tired I am, and how unsatisfying spiritually the job of manhunter is sometimes. When I think of that poor lovely little girl Frances, having to face the world as the sweetheart of a murderer, well, Elle, there's little justice and certainly no mercy in this world. And, of course, I'm more or less responsible for her shame. Yet Ives Pope himself was quite decent a while ago when he telephoned me on hearing the news. I suppose, in one way, I did him and Frances a service. The doorbell rang, and Juna, drying his hands hastily on a kitchen towel, ran to the door. District Attorney Sampson and Timothy Cronin walked in, excited, happy, both talking at once. Queen rose, covering the sheet of paper with a blotter. "Q, old man," cried Sampson, extending both hands. "My congratulations! Have you seen the papers this morning?" "Glory to Columbus," grinned Cronin, holding up a newspaper on which, in screaming headlines, New York was apprised of the capture of Stephen Barry. The inspector's photograph was displayed prominently, and a rhapsodic story captioned "Queen Adds Another Laurel" ran 2 full columns of type down the sheet. The inspector, however, seemed singularly unimpressed. He waved his visitors to chairs and called for coffee, and began to talk about a projected change in the personnel of one of the city departments, as if the field case interested him not at all. "Hear, hear," growled Sampson. "What's the matter with you? You ought to be throwing out your chest, Q. You act as if you'd pulled a dud rather than succeeded." "It's not that, Henry," said the inspector with a sigh. "I just can't seem to be enthusiastic about anything when Ellery isn't by my side. By jingo, I wish he were here instead of in those blamed Maine woods." The 2 men laughed. Juna served the coffee, and for a time the inspector was too occupied with his pastry to brood. Over his cigarette, Cronin remarked, "I, for one, merely dropped in to pay my respects, Inspector, but I'm curious about some aspects of this case. I don't know much about the investigation as a whole, except what Sampson told me on the way up." "I'm rather at sea myself, Q," put in the district attorney. "I imagine you have a story to tell us. Let's have it." Inspector Queen smiled sadly. "To save my own face, I'll have to relate it as if I did most of the work. As a matter of fact, the only really intelligent work in the whole sordid business was Ellery's. He's a sharp lad, that son of mine." Sampson and Cronin relaxed as the inspector took some snuff and settled back in his armchair. Juna folded himself quietly in a corner, ears cocked. "In going over the field case," began the inspector, "I will have to refer at times to Benjamin Morgan, who is really the most innocent victim of all. I want you to bear in mind, Henry, that whatever I say about Morgan is to go no further, either professionally or socially. I already have Tim's assurance of silence." Both men nodded wordlessly. The inspector continued. "I needn't explain that most investigations of crime begin with a search for the motive. Many times you can discard suspect after suspect when you know the reason behind the crime. In this case, the motive was obscure for a long time. There were certain indications, like Benjamin Morgan's story, but these were inconclusive. Morgan had been blackmailed by Field for years, a part of Field's activities of which you gentlemen were ignorant, despite your knowledge of his other social habits. This seemed to point to blackmail as a possible motive, or rather the choking off of blackmail. But then any number of things could have been the motive. Revenge, for example, by some criminal whom Field had been instrumental in sending up, or by a member of his criminal organization. Field had a host of enemies, and undoubtedly a host of friends who were friends only because Field held the whip hand. Any one of scores of people, men and women both, might have had a motive for killing the lawyer. So that, since we had so many other pressing and immediate things to think about and do that night at the Roman Theatre, we did not bother much with motive. It was always in the background, waiting to be called into service. But mark this point. If it was blackmail, as Ellery and I eventually decided, since it seemed the most likely possibility, there were most certainly some papers floating about in Field's possession, which would be enlightening, to say the least. We knew that Morgan's papers existed. Cronin insisted that the papers for which he was looking were about somewhere, so we had to keep our eyes constantly on the alert for papers, tangible evidence which might or might not make clear the essential circumstances behind the crime. At the same time, in the matter of documents, Ellery was piqued by the great number of books on handwriting analysis he found among Field's effects. We concluded that a man like Field, who had blackmailed once to our knowledge, in the case of Morgan, and many times to our suspicions, and who was keenly interested in the science of handwriting, might have been a forger to boot. If this were true, and it seemed a plausible explanation, then it probably meant that Field made a habit of forging the original blackmail papers. The only reason he could have for doing this, of course, would be to sell the forgeries and keep the originals for further extortion. His association with the underworld undoubtedly helped him master the tricks of the trade. Later, we discovered that this hypothesis was true, and by that time we had definitely established blackmail as the motive of the crime. Remember, though, that this led us nowhere, since any one of our suspects might have been the blackmail victim, and we had no way of telling who it was. The inspector frowned, settled back into his seat more comfortably. But I'm tackling this explanation the wrong way. It just goes to show you how habit will take hold of a man. I'm so accustomed to beginning with motive. However, there is only one important and central circumstance which stands out in the investigation. It was a confounding clue, rather the lack of a clue. I refer to the missing hat. Now, the unfortunate thing about the missing hat was that we were so busy pressing the immediate inquiry at the Roman Theatre on Monday night, we couldn't grasp the full significance of its absence. Not that we weren't bothered by it from the beginning, far from it. It was one of the first things I noticed when I examined the body. As for Ellery, he caught it as soon as he entered the theatre and bent over the dead man. But what could we do? There were 100 details to take care of, questions to ask, orders to give, discrepancies and suspicious discoveries to clear up, so that, as I say, we inadvertently missed our great opportunity. If we had fully analyzed the meaning of the hat's disappearance then and there, we might have clinched the case that very night. "Well, it hasn't taken so long after all, you growler," laughed Sampson. "This is Wednesday, and the murder was committed a week ago Monday. Only 9 days. What are you kicking about?" The inspector shrugged. "But it would have made a considerable difference," he said, "if only we had reasoned it out. Well, when finally we did get round to dissecting the problem of the hat, we asked ourselves, first of all, why was the hat taken? Only 2 answers seemed to make sense. 1, that the hat was incriminating in itself. 2, that it contained something which the murderer wanted and for which the crime was committed. As it turned out, both were true. The hat was incriminating in itself because on the underside of the leather sweatband was Stephen Barry's name, printed in indelible ink, and the hat contained something which the murderer very emphatically wanted, the blackmail papers. He thought at the time, of course, that they were the originals. This did not get us very far, but it was a starting point. By the time we left Monday night with the command to shut down the theatre, we had not yet found the missing hat despite a sweeping search. However, we had no way of knowing whether the hat had managed in some mysterious manner to leave the theatre, or whether it was still there, though unrevealed by our search. When we returned to the theatre on Thursday morning, we settled once and for all the question of the location of Monty Field's pesky topper, that is, negatively. It was not in the theatre. That much was certain. And since the theater had been sealed since Monday night, it follows that the hat must have left that same evening. Now, everybody who left Monday night left with only one hat. In the light of our second search, therefore, we were compelled to conclude that somebody had walked out that night with Monty Field's hat in his hand or on his head, necessarily leaving his own in the theater. He could not have disposed of the hat outside the theater except when he left at the time the audience was allowed to leave, for up to that time all exits were guarded or locked, and the left-hand alley was blocked, first by Jess Lynch and Eleanor Libby, next by John Chase, the usher, and after that by one of my policemen. The right-hand alley, having no exit other than the orchestra doors, which were guarded all night, offered no avenue of disposal. To go on with the thought, since Field's hat was a top hat, and since nobody left the theater dressed in a top hat who was not wearing evening clothes, this we watched for very closely. Therefore, the man who took away the missing hat must have been garbed in full dress. You might say that a man planning such a crime in advance would have come to the theater without a hat, and therefore would have none to dispose of. But if you will stop to think, you must see that this is highly improbable. He would have been quite conspicuous, especially while entering the theater, if he went in minus a top hat. It was a possibility, of course, and we kept it in mind, but we reasoned that a man working out such a consummate crime as this would have shied from taking any unnecessary chance of being identified. Also, Ellery had satisfied his own mind that the murderer had no foreknowledge of the field hat's importance. This made it still more improbable the possibility that the murderer arrived without a hat of his own. Having a hat of his own, he might have disposed of it, we thought, during the first intermission, which is to say, before the crime was committed. But Ellery's deductions proving the murderer's lack of foreknowledge made this impossible, since he would not have known at the first intermission of the necessity of doing away with his own hat. At any rate, I think we were justified in assuming that our man had to leave his own hat in the theater, and that it must have been a top hat. Does it follow so far? It seems logical enough, admitted Sampson, though very complicated. You have no idea how complicated it was, said the inspector grimly, since at the same time we had to bear in mind the other possibilities, such as the man walking out with Field's hat being not the murderer, but an accomplice. But let's get on. The next question we asked ourselves was this: what happened to the top hat which the murderer left behind in the theater? What did he do with it? Where did he leave it? I can tell you that was a puzzler. We had ransacked the place from top to bottom. True, we found several hats backstage which Mrs. Phillips, the wardrobe mistress, identified as the personal property of various actors, but none of these was a personally owned top hat. Where, then, was the top hat which the murderer had left behind in the theater? Ellery, with his usual acumen, struck right at the heart of the truth. He said to himself, "The murderer's top hat must be here. We have not found any top hat whose presence is remarkable or out of the ordinary. Therefore, the top hat we are seeking must be one whose presence is not out of the ordinary." Fundamental? Almost ridiculously so, and yet I myself did not think of it. What top hats were there whose presence was not out of the ordinary, so natural and in so natural a place that they were not even questioned? In the Roman theater, where all the costumes were hired from Lebrun, the answer is simply the rented top hats being used for purposes of the play. Where would such top hats be? Either in the actors' dressing rooms or in the general wardrobe room backstage. When Ellery had reached this point in his reasoning, he took Mrs. Phillips backstage and checked up on every top hat in the actors' rooms and the wardrobe room. Every top hat there, and all were accounted for, none being missing, was a property top hat bearing on its lining the Lebrun insignia. Field's hat, which we had proved to be a Brown Brothers topper, was not among the property top hats or anywhere backstage. Since no one left the theater Monday night with more than one top hat, and since Monty Field's hat was unquestionably taken out of the theater that same night, it was positively established that the murderer's own top hat must have been in the Roman all the time the house was sealed, and was still there at the time of our second search. Now, the only top hats remaining in the theater were property top hats. It therefore follows that the murderer's own top hat, which he was forced to leave behind because he walked out with Fields, must have been one of the property hats backstage, since, let me repeat, these were the only top hats of which it could physically have been one. In other words, one of these property top hats backstage belonged to the man who left the theater Monday night in full dress wearing Field's silk topper. If this man were the murderer, and he could scarcely be anyone else, then our field of inquiry was narrowed to a considerable degree. He could only have been either a male member of the cast who left the theater in evening clothes, or somebody closely connected with the theater and similarly dressed. In the latter case, such a person would have had to have, first, a property top hat to leave behind, second, undisputed access to the wardrobe and dressing rooms, and third, the opportunity to leave his property top hat in either place. Now, let us examine the possibilities in the latter case, that the murderer was closely connected with the theater, yet not an actor. The inspector paused to sniff deeply of the snuff in his treasured box. The workmen backstage could be discarded because none of them wore the evening clothes which were necessary in order to take away Field's top hat. The cashiers, ushers, doormen, and other minor employees were eliminated for the same reason. Harry Nielsen, the publicity man, was also dressed in ordinary street clothes. Panzer, the manager, was attired in full dress, it is true, but I took the trouble to check up his head size and found it to be 6 3/4, an unusually small size. It would be virtually impossible for him to have worn Field's hat, which was 7 1/8. It is true that we left the theater before he did. On my way out, however, I definitely instructed Thomas Velli to make no exception in Panzer's case, but to search him as the others had been searched. I had examined Panzer's hat merely from a sense of duty while in his office earlier in the evening, and found it to be a derby. Velli subsequently reported that Panzer walked out with this derby on his head and no other hat in his possession. Now, if Panzer had been the man we were looking for, he might have walked out with Field's hat despite its larger size, by merely holding it in his hand. But when he left with a derby, that was conclusive that he could not have taken away Field's hat, since the theater was shut down immediately after his departure, and no one, my men on duty saw to that, no one entered the premises until Thursday morning under my own eye. Theoretically, it was possible for Panzer, or anyone else in the Roman personnel, to have been the murderer had he been able to secrete Field's top hat in the theater. But this last hypothesis was dissipated by the report of Edmund Crewe, our official architectural expert, who definitely stated that there was no secret hiding place anywhere in the Roman theater. The elimination of Panzer, Nielsen, and the employees left only the cast as possibilities. How we finally narrowed down the field of inquiry until we got to Barry, let's leave for the moment. The interesting part of this case is really the startling and complex series of deductions which gave us the truth purely through logical reasoning. I say us, I should say Ellery. For a police inspector, you are certainly a shrinking violet, chuckled Cronin. By gee, this is better than a detective story. I ought to be working now, but since my boss seems to be as interested as I am, keep going, Inspector. Queen smiled, forging ahead. The fact that the murder was traced to the cast, he continued, answers a question which has probably occurred to you and which certainly troubled us in the beginning. We could not at first understand why the theater should have been chosen as a meeting place for the transaction of secret business. When you stop to think about it, a theater presents enormous disadvantages under ordinary circumstances. Extra tickets, to mention only one thing, have to be bought to ensure privacy through empty seats in the vicinity. What a silly tangle to get into when other meeting places are so much more convenient. A theater is dark most of the time, and disturbingly quiet. Any untoward noise or conversation is remarked. The crowds present a constant danger, one of recognition. However, all this is automatically explained when you realize that Barry was a member of the cast. From his standpoint, the theater was ideal, for who would dream of suspecting an actor of murder when the victim is found dead in the orchestra? Of course, Field acquiesced, never suspecting what was in Barry's mind and that he was conniving his own death. Even if he were a little suspicious, you must remember that he was accustomed to dealing with dangerous people and probably felt capable of taking care of himself. This may have made him a little overconfident. We have no way, of course, of knowing. Let me get back to Ellery again, my favorite subject, continued the inspector with one of his recurrent dry chuckles. Aside from these deductions about the hat, as a matter of fact, before the deductions are completely worked out, Ellery got his first indication of which way the wind blew during the meeting at the Ives Pope house. It was clear that Field had not accosted Francis Ives Pope in the alleyway between acts with merely flirtatious intentions. It seemed to Ellery that some connection existed between the two widely separated individuals. Now, this does not mean that Francis had to be aware of the connection. She was positive that she had never heard of or seen Field before. We had no reason to doubt her, and every reason to believe her. That possible connection might have been Stephen Barry, provided Stephen Barry and Field knew each other without Francis' knowledge. If, for example, Field had an appointment at the theater Monday night with the actor and suddenly saw Francis, it was possible that in his half-drunken mood he would venture to approach her, especially since the subject he and Barry had in common concerned her so deeply. As for recognizing her, thousands of people who read the daily papers know every line of her features. She is a much-photographed young society lady. Field certainly would have acquainted himself with her description and appearance out of sheer thoroughness of business method. But to return to the triangle connection. Field, Francis, Barry, which I will go into in detail later. You realize that no one else in the cast except Barry, who was engaged to Francis and had been publicly announced as her fiancé, with pictures and all the rest of the journalistic business, could have satisfied so well the question, why did Field accost Francis? The other disturbing factor concerning Francis, the discovery of her bag in Field's clothes, was plausibly explained by her dropping it in the natural excitement of the moment when the drunken lawyer approached her. This was later confirmed by Jess Lynch's testimony to the effect that he saw Field pick up Francis' bag. Poor girl, I feel sorry for her. The inspector sighed. To get back to the hat, you'll notice we always return to that blasted top piece, resumed Queen after a pause. I never knew of a case in which a single factor so dominated every aspect of the investigation. Now mark this. Of the entire cast, Barry was the only one who left the Roman Theatre Monday night dressed in evening clothes and top hat. As Ellery watched at the main door Monday night while the people were filing out, his mind characteristically registered the fact that the entire cast, except Barry, left the theater wearing street clothes. In fact, he even mentioned this to Sampson and me in Panzer's office later, although at the time neither of us realized its full significance. Barry was therefore the only member of the cast who could have taken away Field's top hat. Think this over a moment, and you will see that, in view of Ellery's hat deductions, we could now pin the guilt to Barry's shoulders beyond the shadow of a doubt. Our next step was to witness the play, which we did the evening of the day on which Ellery made the vital deductions, Thursday. You can see why. We wanted to confirm our conclusion by seeing whether Barry had the time during the second act to commit the murder. And amazingly enough, of all the members of the cast, Barry was the only one who did have the time. He was absent from the stage from 9:20. He opened the business of the act and left almost at once, until 9:50, when he returned to the stage to remain there until the act ended. This was incontrovertible, part of a fixed and unchanging time schedule. Every other player was either on the stage all the time or else went on and off at extremely short intervals. This means that last Thursday night, more than 5 days ago, and the whole case took only 9 days to consummate, we had solved our mystery. But solving the mystery of the murderer's identity was a far cry from bringing him to justice. You'll see why in a moment. The fact that the murderer could not enter until 9:30 or thereabouts explains why the torn edges of LL32 left and LL30 left did not coincide. It was necessary for Field and Barry, you see, to come in at different times. Field could not very well enter with Barry, or even at a noticeably late hour. The matter of secrecy was too important to Barry, and Field understood, or thought he did, how necessary it was for him to play the secret game. When we pinned the guilt on Barry Thursday night, we resolved to question subtly the other members of the cast as well as workmen backstage. We wanted to find out, of course, whether anyone had actually seen Barry leave or return. As it happened, no one had. Everybody was busy either acting, redressing, or working backstage. We conducted this little investigation after the performance that night, when Barry had already left the theater. And it was checkmate right enough. We had already borrowed a seating plan from Panzer. This map, together with the examination of the alleyway on the left and the dressing room arrangement backstage, an examination made directly after the second act Thursday night, showed us how the murder was committed. Sampson stirred. "I've been puzzling my wits about that," he confessed. "After all, Field was no babe in the woods. This Barry must be a wizard, Q. How did he do it?" "Every riddle is simple when you know the answer," retorted the inspector. Barry, whose freedom began at 9:20, immediately returned to his dressing room, slapped on a quick but thorough facial disguise, donned an evening cloak and the top hat which was part of his costume — you'll remember he was already dressed in evening clothes — and slipped out of his room into the alley. Of course, you can't be expected to know the topography of the theater. There is a series of tiers in a wing of the building backstage, facing the left alley, which is made up of dressing rooms. Barry's room is on the lowest tier, the door opening into the alleyway. There is a flight of iron steps leading down to the pavement. It was through this door that he quitted the dressing room, walking through the dark alley while the side doors of the theater were shut during Act 2. He sneaked out into the street, since there was no guard at the head of the alley at that time, and he knew it, nor had Jess Lynch and his girl arrived, luckily for him, and entered the theater brazenly through the regular front entrance, as if he were a latecomer. He presented his ticket, LL30 left, at the door, muffled in his cloak and, of course, well disguised. As he passed into the theater, he deliberately threw away his ticket stub. This appeared to him to be a wise move, since he figured that if the ticket stub were found there, it would point to a member of the audience and directly away from the stage. Also, if his plans fell through and he were later searched carefully, the finding of the stub on his person would be damning evidence. All in all, he thought his move not only misleading, but protective. But how did he plan to get to the seat without being ushered to it, and therefore seen? Objected Cronin. He hadn't planned to evade the usher, returned the inspector. Naturally, he had hoped, since the play was well on and the theater dark, to gain the last row, the nearest to the door, before the usher could approach. However, even if the usher forestalled him and escorted him to the seat, he was well disguised and in the blackness of the theater proof enough against recognition. So that if things turned out as badly as possible for him, the most that would be remembered was that some man unknown, barely describable in general contour, arrived during the second act. As it happened, he was not accosted, since Madge O'Connell was luckily seated with her lover. He managed to slip into the seat next to Field without being noticed. "Remember what I've just told you," went on the inspector, clearing his dry throat, "is not the result of deduction or investigation. We could have no means of discovering such facts. Barry made his confession last night and cleared up all these points. Knowing the culprit was Barry, of course, we might have reasoned out the entire procedure. It follows simply and is the natural situation if you know the criminal. It wasn't necessary, however. Does that sound like an alibi for Ellery or myself?" "Humph." The old man barely smiled. When he sat down next to Field, he had a carefully planned idea of his course of action. Don't forget that he was on a strict time schedule and could not afford to waste a minute. On the other hand, Field too knew that Barry had to get back, so he made no unnecessary delays. The truth of the matter, as Barry has told us, is that he expected to have a more difficult time with Field than he actually did have. But Field was sociably amenable to Barry's suggestions and conversation, probably because he was quite drunk and expected to receive a huge sum of money within a short time. Barry first requested the papers. When Field cannily asked for the money before he produced the documents, Barry showed him a wallet bulging with apparently genuine bills. It was quite dark in the theater, and Barry did not take the bills apart. Actually, they were stage money. He patted them suggestively and did what Field must have expected, refused to hand over the money until he had checked the documents. Bear in mind that Barry was an accomplished actor and could handle the difficult situation with the confidence imparted to him by his stage training. Field reached under his seat and, to Barry's utter astonishment and consternation, produced his top hat. Barry says that Field remarked, "Never thought I'd keep the papers in this, did you? As a matter of fact, I've dedicated this hat to your history quite exclusively. See, it has your name in it." And with this astounding statement, he turned back the band. Barry used his pocket pencil flashlight and saw his name inked in on the underside of the leather sweatband. Just imagine what went through his mind at this moment. Here he saw what seemed at the moment a ruinous accident to his careful plans. Should Field's hat be examined, and of course it would be at the time of the discovery of the body, then the name Stephen Barry on the band would be overwhelming evidence. Barry had no time to rip out the band. In the first place, he had no knife, unfortunately for him, and in the second place, the hatband was closely and securely stitched to the tough fabric. Working on split time, he saw at once that the only course open to him was to take the hat away after he killed Field. Since he and Field were of the same general physique, with Field wearing an average-sized hat, 7 1/8, he immediately decided to leave the theater wearing or carrying Field's hat. He would deposit his own in the dressing room, where its presence was not out of the way, take Field's hat from the theater with him, and destroy it as soon as he reached his rooms. It also occurred to him that if the hat were by some chance examined as he was leaving the theater, his name printed inside would certainly ward off suspicion. In all probability, it was this fact that made Barry feel he was running into no particular danger, even though he had not foreseen the unexpected circumstance. "Clever rogue," murmured Sampson. "The quick brain, Henry, the quick brain," said Queen gravely. "It has run many a man's neck into the noose." As he made the lightning decision to take the hat, he realized that he could not leave his own in its place. For one thing, his hat was a snap-down, an opera hat, but more important, it had the name of Lebrun, the theater costumer, stamped in it. You can see that this would immediately point to someone in the cast, just the thing he wished to avoid. He told me also that, at the moment, and for quite some time thereafter, he felt that the most the police could deduce from the hat's being missing was that it was taken because it contained something valuable. He could not see how this investigatory guess would point the finger of suspicion anywhere near him. When I explained to him the series of deductions Ellery made from the mere fact that the top hat was missing, he was utterly astounded. You can see now that the only really fundamental weakness of his crime was due not to an oversight or a mistake on his part, but to an occurrence which he could not possibly have foreseen. It forced his hand, and the entire chain was started. Had Barry's name not been lettered in Field's hat, there was no question in my mind but that he would be a free and unsuspected man today. The police records would carry another unsolved murder on its pages. I need not state that this entire train of thought flashed through his brain in less time than it takes to describe. He saw what he had to do, and his plans adjusted themselves instantly to the new development. When Field extracted the papers from the hat, Barry examined them cursorily under the lawyer's watchful eye. He did this by the same pencil flashlight, a tiny streak of illumination quite obscured by their shielding bodies. The papers seemed in good order and complete. But Barry did not spend much time over the papers at the moment. He looked up with a rueful smile and said, "Seem to be all here, damn you," very naturally, as if they were enemies under a truce, and he was being a good sport. Field interpreted the remark for what it was intended to convey. Barry dipped into his pocket. The light was out now, and, as if he were nervous, took a swig at a pocket flask of good whiskey. Then, as if recollecting his manners, he asked Field pleasantly enough if he would not take a drink to bind the bargain. Field, having seen Barry drink from the flask, could have no suspicion of foul play. In fact, he probably never dreamed that Barry would try to do him in. Barry handed him a flask. But it wasn't the same flask. Under cover of the darkness, he had taken out two flasks, the one he himself used coming from his left hip pocket, the flask he gave Field coming from his right hip pocket. In handing it over to Field, he merely switched flasks. It was very simple, and made simpler because of the darkness and the fuddled condition of the lawyer. The ruse of the flask worked, but Barry had taken no chances. He had in his pocket a hypodermic filled with the poison. If Field had refused to drink, Barry was prepared to plunge the needle into the lawyer's arm or leg. He possessed a hypodermic needle which a physician had procured for him many years before. Barry had suffered from nervous attacks and could not remain under a doctor's care since he was traveling from place to place with a stock company. The hypodermic was untraceable, therefore, on a cold trail years old, and he was ready if Field refused to drink. So you see, his plan, even in this particular, was foolproof. From which Field drank contained good whiskey all right, but mixed with tetraethyl lead in a copious dose. The poison's slight ether smell was lost in the reek of the liquor, and Field, drinking, gulped down a huge mouthful before he realized that anything was wrong, if he did at all. Mechanically, he returned the flask to Barry, who pocketed it and said, "I guess I'll look over these papers more carefully. There's no reason why I should trust you, Field." Field, who was feeling extremely disinterested by this time, nodded in a puzzled sort of way and slumped down in his seat. Barry really did examine the papers, but he watched Field like a hawk out of the corner of his eye all the time. In about 5 minutes, he saw that Field was out for good. He was not entirely unconscious, but well under way. His face was contorted, and he was gasping for breath. He seemed unable to make any violent muscular movement or outcry. Of course, he'd utterly forgotten Barry. In his agony, perhaps didn't remain conscious very long. When he groaned those few words to Pusak, it was the superhuman effort of a practically dead man. Barry now consulted his watch. It was 9:40. He had been with Field only 10 minutes. He had to be back on the stage at 9:50. He decided to wait 3 minutes more. It had taken less time than he had figured, to make sure that Field would not raise a rumpus. At 9:43 exactly, with Field terribly inanimate in his internal agonies, Barry took Field's hat, snapped down his own and slipped it under his cloak, and rose. The way was clear. Hugging the wall, walking down the aisle as carefully and unobtrusively as possible, he gained the rear of the left side boxes without anyone noticing him. The play was at its highest point of tension. All eyes were riveted on the stage. In the rear of the boxes, he ripped off the false hair, rapidly adjusted his makeup, and passed through the stage door. The door leads into a narrow passageway, which in turn leads into a corridor, branching out to various parts of the backstage area. His dressing room is a few feet from the entrance to the corridor. He slipped inside, threw his stage hat among his regular effects, dashed the remaining contents of the death flask into the wash bowl, and cleaned out the flask. He emptied the contents of the hypodermic into the toilet drain and put away the needle, cleaned. If it was found, what of it? He had a perfectly sound excuse for owning it, and besides, the murder had not been committed by such an instrument at all. He was now ready for his cue, calm, debonair, a little bored. The call came at exactly 9:50. He went on the stage and was there until the hue and cry was raised at 9:55 in the orchestra. "Talk about your complicated plots," ejaculated Sampson. "It is not so complicated as it seems at first hearing," returned the inspector. "Remember that Barry is an exceptionally clever young man, and above all, an excellent actor. No one but an accomplished actor could have carried off such a plan. The procedure was simple after all. His hardest job was to keep to his time schedule. If he was seen by anyone, he was disguised. The only dangerous part of his scheme was the getaway, when he walked down the aisle and went backstage through the box stage door. The aisle he took care of by keeping an eye out for the usher while he sat next to Field. He had known beforehand, of course, that the ushers, due to the nature of the play, kept their stations more or less faithfully, but he counted on his disguise and hypodermic to help him through any emergency that might arise. However, Madge O'Connell was lax in her duty, and so even this was in his favor. He told me last night, not without a certain pride, that he had prepared for every contingency. As for the stage door, he knew from experience that at that period in the play's progress practically everyone was on the stage. The technical men were busy at their stations, too. Remember that he planned the crime knowing in advance the exact conditions under which he would have to operate. And if there was an element of danger, of uncertainty, well, it was all a risky business, wasn't it? He asked me last night, smiling. And I had to admire him for his philosophy, if for nothing else. The inspector shifted restlessly. This makes clear, I hope, just how Barry did the job. As for our investigation, with the hat deductions made and our knowledge of the murderer's identity, we still had no inkling of the exact circumstances behind the crime. If you have been keeping in mind the material evidence which we had collected by Thursday night, you will see that we had nothing at all with which to work. The best thing we could hope for was that somewhere among the papers for which all of us were looking was a clue which would tie up to Barry. Even that would not be enough, but— So, the next step, said the inspector after a sigh, was the discovery of the papers in Field's neat hiding place at the top of the bed canopy in his apartment. This was Ellery's work from start to finish. We had found out that Field had no safety deposit box, no post office box, no outside residence, no friendly neighbor or tradesman, and that the documents were not in his office. By a process of elimination, Ellery insisted that they must be somewhere in Field's rooms. You know how this search ended, an ingenious bit of pure reasoning on Ellery's part. We found Morgan's papers. We found Cronin's stuff relating to the gang activities. And by the way, Tim, I'm going to be keenly alive to what happens when we start on the big cleanup. And we found, finally, a wad of miscellaneous papers. Among these were Michael's and Barry's. You'll remember, Tim, that Ellery, from the handwriting analysis business, deduced that possibly we would find the originals of Barry's papers, and so we did. Michael's case was interesting. That time he went to Elmira on the petty larceny charge, it was through Field's clever manipulations with the law. But Field had the goods on Michaels and filed the documentary evidence of the man's real guilt away in his favorite hiding place, in the event that he might wish to use it at some future date. A very saving person, this Field. When Michaels was released from prison, Field used him unscrupulously for his dirty work, holding the thread of those papers over the man's head. Now, Michaels had been on the lookout for a long time. He wanted the papers badly, as you can imagine. At every opportunity, he searched the apartment for them. And when he didn't find them time after time, he became desperate. I don't doubt that Field, in his devilishly sardonic way, enjoyed the knowledge that Michaels was ransacking the place day after day. On Monday night, Michaels did what he said he did, went home and to bed. But early Tuesday morning, when he read the papers and learned that Field had been killed, he realized that the jig was up. He had to make one last search for the papers. If he didn't find them, the police might, and he would be in hot water. So he risked running into the police net when he returned to Field's rooms Tuesday morning. The story about the check was nonsense, of course. But let's get back to Barry. The original papers we found in the hat marked miscellaneous told a sordid story. Stephen Barry, to make it short and ugly, has a strain of Negroid blood in his veins. He was born in the South of a poor family, and there was definite documentary evidence, letters, birth records, and the like, to prove that his blood had the black taint. Now Field, as you know, made it his business to run things like this to earth. In some way, he got hold of the papers. How long ago, we can't say, but certainly quite a while back. He looked up Barry's status at the time and found him to be a struggling actor, on his uppers more often than he was in funds. He decided to let the fellow alone for the time. If ever Barry came into money or in the limelight, there would be time enough to blackmail him. Field's wildest dreams could not have foreseen Barry's engagement to Frances Ives Pope, daughter of a multimillionaire and blue-blood society girl. I needn't explain what it would have meant to Barry to have the story of his mixed blood become known to the Ives Popes. Besides, and this is quite important, Barry was in a constant state of impoverishment due to his gambling. What money he earned went into the pockets of the bookmakers at the racetrack, and in addition, he had contracted enormous debts which he could never have wiped out unless his marriage to Frances went through. So pressing was his need, in fact, that it was he who subtly urged an early marriage. I had been wondering just how he regarded Frances sentimentally. I don't think, in all fairness to him, that he was marrying wholly because of the money involved. He really loves her, I suppose, but then who wouldn't? The old man smiled reminiscently and went on. Field approached Barry some time ago with the papers, secretly, of course. Barry paid what he could, but it was woefully little, and naturally did not satisfy the insatiable blackmailer. He kept putting Field off desperately. But Field himself was getting into hot water because of his own gambling, and was calling in his little business deals one by one. Barry, pushed to the wall, realized that unless Field were silenced, everything would be lost. He planned the murder. He saw that even if he did manage to raise the $50,000 Field demanded, a palpable impossibility, and even if he did get the original papers, yet Field might still wreck his hopes by merely circulating the story. There was only one thing to do: kill Field. He did it. "Black blood, eh?" murmured Cronin. "Poor devil." "You would scarcely guess it from his appearance," remarked Sampson. "He looks as white as you or I." "Barry isn't anywhere near a full-blooded Negro," protested the inspector. "He has just a drop in his veins, just a drop, but it would have been more than enough for the Ives Popes." To get on. When the papers had been discovered and read, we knew everything: who, how, why the crime was committed. So we took stock of our evidence to bring about a conviction. You can't hail a man into court on a murder charge without evidence. Well, what do you think we had? Nothing. Let me discuss the clues which might have been useful as evidence. The lady's purse. That was out. Valueless, as you know. The source of the poison. A total failure. Incidentally, Barry did procure it exactly as Dr. Jones suggested. Jones, the toxicologist. Barry bought ordinary gasoline and distilled the tetraethyl lead from it. There was no trace left. Another possible clue: Monty Field's hat. It was gone. The extra tickets for the 6 vacant seats, we had never seen them, and there seemed little chance that we ever would. The only other material evidence, the papers, indicated motive but proved nothing. By this token, Morgan might have committed the crime, or any member of Field's criminal organization. Our only hope for bringing about a conviction depended upon our scheme to have Barry's apartment burglarized, in the hope that either the hat or the tickets or some other clue like the poison or the poison apparatus would be found. Veli got me a professional housebreaker, and Barry's apartment was rifled Friday night while he was acting his role in the theater. Not a trace of any of these clues came to light. The hat, the tickets, the poison, everything had been destroyed. Obviously, Barry would have done that. We could only make sure. In desperation, I called a meeting of a number of the Monday night audience, hoping that I would find someone who remembered seeing Barry that night. Sometimes, people recall events later which they forgot completely in the excitement of a previous quizzing. But this, too, as it happened, was a failure. The only thing of value that turned up was the Orangeade boy's testimony about seeing Field pick up an evening bag in the alley. This got us nowhere as far as Barry was concerned, however. And remember that when we questioned the cast Thursday night, we got no direct evidence from them. So there we were, with a beautifully hypothetical statement of facts for a jury, but not a shred of genuine evidence. The case we had to present would have offered no difficulties to a shrewd defending attorney. It was all circumstantial evidence, based chiefly on reasoning. You know as well as I do what a chance such a case would have in court. Then my troubles really began, for Ellery had to leave town. I racked my brains, the few I have. Queen scowled at his empty coffee cup. Things looked black enough. How could I convict a man without evidence? It was maddening. And then Ellery did me the final service of wiring me a suggestion. "A suggestion?" asked Cronin. "A suggestion that I do a little blackmailing myself." "Blackmailing yourself?" Sampson stared. "I don't see the point." "Trust Ellery to make a point that on the surface is obscure," retorted the inspector. I saw at once that the only course left open to me was to manufacture evidence. Both men frowned in puzzlement. "It's simple enough," said Queen. "Field was killed by an unusual poison, and Field was killed because he was blackmailing Barry. Wasn't it fair for me to assume that if Barry were suddenly blackmailed on the identical score, he would again use poison, and in all likelihood the same poison? I don't have to tell you that once a poisoner, always a poisoner. In the case of Barry, if I could only get him to try to use that tetraethyl lead on somebody else, I'd have him. The poison is almost unknown, but I needn't explain further. You can see that if I caught him with tetraethyl lead, that would be all the evidence I needed." How to accomplish the feat was another matter. The blackmail opportunity fitted the circumstances perfectly. I actually had the original papers pertaining to Barry's parentage and tainted blood. Barry thought these destroyed. He had no reason to suspect that the papers he took from Field were clever forgeries. If I blackmailed him, he was in the same boat as before. Consequently, he would have to take the same action. And so I used our friend Charlie Michaels. The only reason I utilized him was that, to Barry, it would seem logical that Michaels, Field's crony and bully and constant companion, should be in possession of the original papers. I got Michaels to write a letter, dictated by me. The reason I wanted Michaels to write it was that possibly Barry, through association with Field, was familiar with the man's handwriting. This may seem a small point, but I couldn't take any chances. If I slipped up on my ruse, Barry would see through it at once, and I'd never get him again. I enclosed a sheet of the original papers in the letter to show that the new blackmailing threat had teeth. I stated that Field had brought Barry copies. The sheet enclosed proved my statement. Barry had no reason in the world to doubt that Michaels was milking him as his master had done before. The letter was so worded as to be an ultimatum. I set the time and the place, and to make a long story short, the plan worked. I guess that's all, gentlemen. Barry came. He had his trusty little hypodermic filled with tetraethyl lead, also a flask, an exact replica, you see, of the field crime, except for the locale. My man, it was Ritter, was instructed to take no chances. As soon as he recognized Barry, he covered him and raised the alarm. Luckily, we were almost at their elbows behind the bushes. Barry was desperate and would have killed himself and Ritter too if he'd had half a chance. There was a significant silence as the inspector finished, sighed, leaned forward, and took some snuff. Sampson shifted in his chair. "Listens like a thriller, Q," he said admiringly. "But I'm not clear on a few points. For example, if this tetraethyl lead is so little known, how on earth did Barry ever find out about it, to the degree of actually making some himself?" "Oh," the inspector smiled. "That worried me from the moment Jones described the poison. I was in the dark even after the capture. And yet, it just goes to show how stupid I am. The answer was under my nose all the time. You will remember that at the Ives Pope place a certain Dr. Cornish was introduced. Now, Cornish is a personal friend of the old financier, and both of them are interested in medical science. In fact, I recall Ellery's asking at one time, 'Didn't Ives Pope recently donate $100,000 to the Chemical Research Foundation?' That was true. It was on the occasion of a meeting in the Ives Pope house one evening several months ago that Barry accidentally found out about tetraethyl lead. A delegation of scientists had called upon the magnate, introduced by Cornish, to request his financial aid in the foundation. In the course of the evening, the talk naturally turned to medical gossip and the latest scientific discoveries. Barry admitted that he overheard one of the directors of the foundation, a famous toxicologist, relate to the group the story of the poison. At this time, Barry had no idea he would put the knowledge to use. When he decided to kill Field, he saw the advantages of the poison and its untraceable source immediately. "What the deuce was the significance of that message you sent to me by Louis Panzer Thursday morning, Inspector?" inquired Cronin curiously. "Remember? Your note requested that I watch Lewin and Panzer when they met to see if they knew each other. As I reported to you, I asked Lewin later, and he denied any acquaintance with Panzer. What was the idea?" "Panzer," repeated the inspector softly. "Panzer has always intrigued me, Tim. At the time I sent him to you, remember the hat deductions which absolved him had not yet been made. I sent him to you merely out of a sense of curiosity. I thought that if Lewin recognized him, it might point to a connection between Panzer and Field. My thought was not borne out. It wasn't too hopeful to begin with. Panzer might have been acquainted with Field on the outside without Lewin's knowledge. On the other hand, I didn't particularly want Panzer hanging around the theater that morning, so the errand did both of us a lot of good." "Well, I hope you are satisfied with that package of newspapers I sent you in return, as you instructed," grinned Cronin. "How about the anonymous letter Morgan received? Was that a blind or what?" demanded Sampson. "It was a sweet little frame-up," returned Queen grimly. "Barry explained that to me last night. He had heard of Morgan's threat against Field's life. He didn't know, of course, that Field was blackmailing Morgan, but he thought it might plant a strong false trail if he got Morgan to the theater on a thin story Monday night. If Morgan didn't come, there was nothing lost. If he did, he worked it this way. He chose ordinary cheap notepaper, went down to one of the typewriter agencies, and wearing gloves, typed the letter, signed it with that useless scrawled initial, and mailed the thing from the General Post Office. He was careful about fingerprints, and certainly the note could never be traced to him. As luck would have it, Morgan swallowed the bait and came. The very ridiculousness of Morgan's story and the obvious falsity of the note, as Barry figured, made Morgan a strong suspect. On the other hand, Providence seemed to provide compensations. For the information we got from Morgan about Field's blackmailing activities did Mr. Barry a heap of harm. He couldn't have foreseen that, though." Sampson nodded. "I can think of only one other thing. How did Barry arrange for the purchase of the tickets? Or did he arrange for it at all? He certainly did. Barry convinced Field that, as a matter of fairness to himself, the meeting and the transfer of paper should take place in the theater under a cloak of absolute secrecy. Field was agreeable and was easily persuaded to purchase the 8 tickets at the box office. He himself realized that the 6 extra tickets were needed to ensure privacy. He sent Barry 7, and Barry promptly destroyed them all except LL30 left. The inspector rose, smiling tiredly. "Juna," he said in a low voice, "some more coffee." Sampson stopped the boy with a protesting hand. "Thanks, Q, but I've got to be going. Cronin and I have loads of work on this gang affair. I couldn't rest, though, until I got the whole story from your own lips. Q, old man," he added awkwardly, "I'm really sincere when I say that I think you've done a remarkable piece of work." "I never heard of anything like it," put in Cronin heartily. "What a riddle, and what a beautiful piece of clear reasoning from beginning to end." "Do you really think so?" asked the inspector quietly. "I'm so glad, gentlemen, because all the credit rightfully belongs to Ellery. I'm rather proud of that boy of mine." When Sampson and Cronin had departed, and Juna had retired to his tiny kitchen to watch the breakfast dishes, the inspector turned to his writing desk and took up his fountain pen. He rapidly read over what he had written to his son. Sighing, he put the pen to paper once more. "Let's forget what I just wrote. More than an hour has passed since then. Sampson and Tim Cronin came up, and I had to crystallize our work on the case for their benefit. I never saw such a pair. Kids, both of 'em. Gobble the story as if it were a fairy tale. As I talked, I saw with appalling clarity how little I actually did and how much you did. I'm pining for the day when you will pick out some nice girl and be married, and then the whole darned Queen family can pack off to Italy and settle down to a life of peace. Well, El, I've got to dress and go down to headquarters. A lot of routine work has collected since last Monday, and my job is just about cut out for me." "When are you coming home? Don't think I want to rush you, but it's so gosh awful lonesome, son. No, I guess I'm selfish as well as tired. Just a doddering old fogey who needs coddling. But you will come home soon, won't you? Juna sends his regards. The rascal is taking my ears off with the dishes in the kitchen. Your loving father." End of Chapter 22. The End of The Roman Hat Mystery by Ellery Queen.